Yeah, I don't think I have the audio on there for that. Okay, so but the transcription's on there, so sorry about that. So chapter 11 gets cut out. There are a couple other things that get cut out. Anyway, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the syllabus, and not a great deal of time, just so that we all know what's going on. And you know, all this information at the top is all boilerplate information, so you should be good to go as far as that goes. The course descriptions just basically comes out of the catalog. Student learning objectives, we'll be talking about things like opportunity cost, comparative advantage, and exchange. Probably not very much on comparative advantage, probably not very much on exchange, which deals with mostly foreign exchange. That's another thing that I cut out of this class, was a lot of the international piece. And some students want to hear more about that. And when in the full term section, we usually have more time to talk about things like the dollar, euro, dollar, peso, those sort of relationships. We don't really have a chance to do that, so we're probably not going to get there. We'll talk about demand and supply. We'll get to that next week. We will talk about circular flow today, talk about who's who in the actor groups, and talk about GDP, inflation, unemployment. And by the way, I do expect inflation to be a significant topic of discussion, mostly because it is the current economic bad guy at the moment. So it really is. And for as long as I've been teaching, we've always taught inflation. I've sort of likened inflation discussions to kind of like up until just the last year or something, like in medical school, you know, maybe reading about malaria or some disease you're probably not going to run across, like malaria patients in Alaska, right? Just like I read a story about a guy who was on an airplane to Fairbanks and got bit by a scorpion on the airplane. And he got to Fairbanks and the hospital didn't know how to treat a scorpion bite. So they've never seen one before. So inflation is something that we really haven't seen a lot of for a long time, but we're going to talk about it because it is a real and current economic issue that's going on, and that really needs to be understood, and moreover, what to do about it. And since we're in election season, maybe try to dispel some of the myths about who's responsible for inflation. It's not Joe Biden. When you like him, don't like him, Joe Biden has got about 1% to do with the inflationary situation. And in fact, any president, regardless of who the president is, has very little to do with economic performance because they just really don't have their hands on the levers of control. They really don't. And I know that that's not what people believe. Everyone believes things are great, the president must be a genius. If things are bad, the president's a fool, right? Not so much the case. Not so much the case. So we're going to try to dispel that particular bit of myths. And then, you know, the attendance policy, you know how that works. And so I won't need to go through that. So here's the setup. Hopefully you've seen that. We have 2 exams in the course coming up around week 4 and week 7. And those will probably be in Brightspace, the way it looks. I know that in the past we usually did those in class. But let me find out for sure. I don't know. I know that up until this is the first time that I've taught this class since COVID began. And so I know that we had to do a lot of stuff in Brightspace because we weren't physically meeting. So this is the first group because I always teach in the very last block. So I need to find out what that is, but I'll let you know. The quizzes definitely will be in Brightspace for sure, because you've got multiple opportunities to take those. You can take those over and over again as many times as you like. And then the discussions, we have a weekly discussion, and the breakdown of how that works is listed here on the syllabus. And as to discussions, I know this is always something that probably needs to be explained a little bit more in depth, but there's a link that I put in the discussions link in Brightspace. So if you go to coursework or discussions, then you'll see there's a link called discussion guidelines. And basically what it's saying is just to sort of be on point with the discussion, not to try to get off track. I know that a lot of students, just as it's human nature, try to, you know, reply to each other, and you know, that's about 7 or 8 sentences about you know, something which is completely irrelevant to anything at all, and that's it. And then post ends up, and nobody's ever discussed anything in terms of the reply. So try to stay on task, if you would. Try to stay away from what we would consider to be conversational sorts of posts. The lowest of these will be dropped from final score. And as we get closer to that, I'll also remind you, I know that not this last cohort that graduated, but 2 of them ago, everybody had a gigantic freak out and involved pretty much everybody in the business school saying, what's going on, because I zeroed out the lowest discussion score. And it's like, why did you make that 0? It was 25, and then it goes down to 0. What are you doing? And it's like, well, that's how you remove the score. Choose 0 out. So, so I want to make sure everybody is familiar with what that means, is to 0 it out. I know, and I know Rochelle was telling me there's a way to do it where you can simply take the highest score cumulatively, but then you don't start seeing scores because it doesn't count either one or week 1 or week 2. So you're always like lagging, if you know what that means. I mean, it just drops off the lowest one, but then you don't start seeing scores until week 2, and you only see whichever was higher from week 1 or week 2. I don't like that very much. I'd rather just adjust it at the end, but I just want to make sure everyone is aware of what we're doing. We're dropping that in order really to make the math work, to be honest with you, and to sort of give you a bit of familiarity with where things are more on a more current basis. Everything is auto-graded with the exception of discussions, and I'll try to grade those within a week of that period of time. Late work is possible, you can do it. I know the school usually has a success at late assessment of about 10%, so we'll have to take that as it comes. There's probably not going to be a lot of that, and you probably don't want to get behind here. That's probably not the place to do it. And I'll let you read the rest on your own. And I like Ben White. I would read the syllabus. So I can't believe you even told me that. I've never read the syllabus. So do not do as Ben White does. In that case, you should read the syllabus. So anyway, I deliberately made week 1 to be fairly straightforward and not particularly involved. So the first 2 chapters, as well as the chapter 1 appendix. The chapter 1 appendix is a math piece, and what it basically is, and I usually describe this in a couple of different ways. Number one, it sort of sets the discussion about what kind of math is involved in the graphing of things like functions and curves in economics, the way that we sort of illustrate economic phenomena. But what it also does is sort of set the outer limit for what's not covered. And I know that there occasionally, and I know people come to this class and maybe every class with varying degrees of math comfort level, and some approaching hysteria and anxiety on the one hand, some being super confident on the other. And I know it's a wide spectrum. And I've had students who have ended up dropping a class very early on, thinking that there's going to be a lot of hardcore calculus, and there is 0 calculus in the class. In fact, I don't think any of us in my econ department here use any calculus. So did you use any of that in your business math course, any calculus at all? Or? You didn't get into it very much? Okay. All right. Well, there's none of that. So I'll have a brief discussion. Would it be helpful for me to take a few minutes just to kind of summarize what chapter 1 is about, or the appendix is about? I'll do that before we leave. And if I don't get anything done today, we've got plenty of time in order to pick up lost ground. And the good thing about, 7 weeks sounds like it's really fast, but in a lot of ways we've got lots of flexibility. We are going to lose a class session, and it's right here. Yeah. So we're going to miss this.
Were you recording? Did you want to record right now, or?
I'm recording now. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you wanted us to check. But...
Oh no, I just want to make sure you can get in. Yeah, I just want to make sure you can get in. And I couldn't tell whether or not it was recording. It should be lit up on my screen here, but it's not. Usually there's like a red button that lights up, but I'm not seeing it. So. No, okay. No, it is. Oh, it's up here. Okay. All these computers are a little bit. So anyway, it's reporting. So we're going to lose a week here. And what I'll probably do, to be honest with you, is I'll probably come in on that Wednesday before Thanksgiving and just record a lecture and send you a YouTube video link to it. Okay, that's probably what I'll do. So that way you've got it. And hopefully everyone will look at it. But if you don't look at it, I'm not going to police that, obviously. But but I think it's important that we don't lose a lot of time just because of the fact of a holiday. But nobody wants to have you come in on Thanksgiving. That would be kind of atrocious, wouldn't it? So, and even if I said, "Hey, I'm going to be here on Thanksgiving," I think you should too. Nobody would show up. So it's not like that's it's not like that's a thing. So I'll just come in on probably on Wednesday because the campus will be closed, totally closed. I can't even get in the building, I think, from that Thursday through Sunday. So I don't want to wait until after that period. So I don't have class on any other class on Wednesdays because I've got a class. Actually, I do. I have a class next door, and maybe I'll just record it there and then just send you the link. Yeah, I've got a class right next door. I'll probably just stay and record that. So that's anyway, but we'll get to that as we get a little bit closer. So this week, the only thing we have to do is these chapters and then week one discussion. So week one's discussion is about economic systems. And what I'm simply asking you is just to pick a country, any country, and just say what kind of system it is. And you've got really two polar opposites. You've got a pure capitalist economy on the one hand, and pure command on the other. And I will say that pure command economy would be something like I don't know that too many people are going to do it, but what would one example of pure command economy? The government has got a monopoly on everything. What's that?
China.
Yeah, China, close. Yeah, China probably certainly at one time did. But like even the most extreme examples, something like North Korea, maybe Cuba, that sort of thing. And in reality, most economies are mixed. There's this big middle ground there, but they lean in one direction or the other. And then we always said that on the furthest extreme of a pure capitalist economy would be something like Singapore, maybe, where it's very little regulation, just kind of free for all. In the old days, Hong Kong, before Hong Kong was back part of mainland China, Hong Kong was a wild and crazy place, and just lots of people doing whatever the heck they wanted to do without much regulation. So, and regulation seems to be, and government control is a critical element of a lot of what we're going to be talking about, particularly as we get deeper into the class and we start talking about economic theory and what differentiates the major schools of economic theory is really government regulation. That's really the big issue, okay, is government regulation. Okay.
I have a quick question about
Sure.
due dates.
Yeah.
So obviously, the due date that you're showing up there is yesterday.
Right.
So are these?
Okay, I'm not worried about week one really so much. So you can take until Sunday to do this week's discussion. I know a few of you have already done that. That's fine. And just and just reply to others if you would. It doesn't have to be anything big. I know sometimes people when I have the discussion guidelines link, they sort of misconstrue it to think that they've got to have, like 3 or 4 paragraphs and sources, and you never need any sources in these discussions. I mean, you're free to, if you want to go cite a source, that's fine, but you don't have to. So.
On the discussion, there was something in there that we have to make 2 different postings on 2 separate days.
That's my ideal, is that right?
So is that like our initial post and then our reply on the second day? Is that what you
Yeah,
want?
but this week is not so critical because I'll just let you do it through Sunday, given the fact that we're it's the first week and you're sort of getting your feet wet with what we're doing here. As we go forward, just make a post, let's say by Friday. Does that sound reasonable to everybody, your initial post? I know,
Okay.
remember Wednesdays is what the official due date is, right?
Yeah, that's what you had on there.
And that's what I've got on the syllabus, but I don't really care. Would an extra couple days be helpful to you? I mean, how can it not be? I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous question, I really.
Is it gonna be a discussion before we discuss?
Well, that's why I'm pushing it to Friday, because probably the material, you may overlap a bit with what's coming up or what has already been discussed, but it will definitely be a topic that's somewhere addressed in the textbook. So, so I'm not going to pull something out of the sky. It's going to be something that's related. So even if you aren't at the class that a particular week, you can still do the discussion based just on what's going on within text, and so you can just read in the textbook itself. Okay.
Because I was confused when I was reading it.
Yeah.
Can we do our reactions or our responses?
On one other day. Yeah.
It's just one day. I don't have to like do a response one day and then a response another.
Yes, you should do it. Yeah, you should do responses on one other day. One other day. So Friday, and you can do your initial response on Monday if you want. Somebody posts on Monday and you want to do a reply post to them, do it on Monday. That's fine. They come in any order they like. I know that technically you should make your initial post by Wednesday. That's the official policy, but I'd like to kind of give you a little bit more time to do that. Particularly on things like quizzes, I don't think it's really a great idea to have you take a quiz like next week, because next week's quiz is basically going to cover these guys here. And take a quiz before you heard about the material yet. So and that's the way I understand how most of these classes operate, is you take a quiz. That you might be faced with a quiz on the material. I would rather have you take that and have it do Sunday. Now I already went and put up for Sunday. 11/6 is Sunday, 11/13 is Sunday. But 11/2 is obviously Wednesday. Well, that's really 11/4. That makes sense, right? And hopefully this is clear that everyone's watching on the video saying, what on earth is he doing, right? So all I'm trying to do is be accommodative to what your lives are about. And the reason we do 2 different days is basically, it's when online education really started, it was sort of a proxy for in-person classes. A lot of college classes typically meet twice a week. It's showing up twice a week is basically what it is. And especially purely online courses. And so that's what's going on there. You won't lose a tremendous amount if you do it on the same day, but you do want to just make another post. And I wouldn't go to great lengths. Stay on topic, but I wouldn't go into great lengths. I usually say in the discussion guidelines link, I'll say a good paragraph. And I think I even define a paragraph as 3 sentences or more, which is not a whole heck of a lot. But don't waste your 3 sentences on, oh, hi, you know, I remember seeing that movie and I thought Scarlett Johansson looked like a serial killer or whatever. I'm sure that's probably not all she's ever played, but anyway, you get the idea. I mean, sometimes it gets off into Neverland, and then, oh yeah, this is Econ, yeah, you know, that sort of thing. So you want to try to stay a little bit more on focus. And if you do that, you should be fine. And I usually try to show up 4 or 5 times a week, just to sort of put my 2 cents in. And a lot of times I'll just try to it'll be a teaching point that I want to pick up on. If somebody brings up something that I think is worthy to discuss, and I'll just sort of run with that and just sort of add to it. And you know, and I got a lot to say about economics, and so that's how we'll cover it. So okay, and so everyone's familiar with how to work exams and quizzes in Brightspace, right? It's not a particular mystery, I think, at this point. So you should be good to go, and you should be fine as far as that goes. One other thing I was going to ask the class, and I just want to get your feeling, because I've had the class consensus has been all over the place since we've started this program, and some have said, "Hey, will you open up every single module between now and week 7?" Because right now, I usually just put week 1 as availability, and some have said, "I want to see all week 7, so I know what we're looking at," right? Including things like PowerPoint slides and all that. Some have said we could. Some have just said, "Well, no, I don't, it doesn't." You know, if they don't care, they have no opinion. It's those who really care who do have an opinion. So, do you have an opinion? Do you want me to put everything out there now for you to look at, or would that just be too much, overwhelming? Do you care?
It would depend on what you allow, like if you allow us to work ahead.
You can, as far as the discussions go, that's fine. I would really discourage you from taking quizzes early. I know that, and I've heard this for years, people saying, "I'd like to take my quiz on." And sometimes I have students who say, "Look, I'm going to be in Brazil for a month. I've got to take, well, will you let me take everything early? I promise, I'll do it. You know, and I'll get it done." And they usually do, but oftentimes it's difficult for them just because the fact that they haven't, you know, they're really not ready for it yet. So I can make the quizzes available to you as well if you like, but I really sort of discourage you from doing that. So you want to think about that, or
I mean, we can get to the chapters, we can work ahead in the chapters and read ahead any.
absolutely, right?
Yeah, as long as we can do that. I
We
mean,
can read it in-
yeah,
I think
it's
we need
nice.
to have access to it.
Access to it, okay.
Yeah. To all the materials, just because sometimes you can finish something sooner with another class and then maybe start.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, I know. Before the lesson, I want to make sure we're ready for it.
Well, and I know that I teach an econ course, a macro course in what's called a flex program, and Ben teaches that as well. But it's independent study, and students just we don't have Zoom meetings, we don't have lectures, we don't have anything. We just say, do these assignments and turn them in, and every time you turn them in, I'll grade them, and we'll get back to you. And I got like 14 people who are finishing macro right now. Yeah. So there are people who do it. You know, I think it's difficult, but I'll let you decide that. You won't be required to work it clearly. That's that. It would be a ridiculous requirement, but if you want to have that available, you can. Now, the good thing about quizzes, you've got 4 of them, is you can take them again and again and again, you know, for as many times as you like. So that's available to you. So if you know, and I've had students who've taken 40, 70 times and whatnot. And I can go in and see the number of attempts. And I'm thinking 70 times, there's something, Houston, you've got a problem. Something has gone wrong here, really.
Yeah.
But what I'll do is, as the quizzes, come due, I'll wait a week because there's a makeup period for those who can't take it for whatever reason. And I know that some instructors, probably even within this program, I don't know, because it's not like share information on this, but probably don't like a lot of makeups, particularly in an accelerated program like this, accelerated in terms of time frame. I just kind of think that the way modern students are, busy lives or whatnot, the majority of the term traditional student used to mean 18 to 22, full-time student, part-time working. Today it's just the opposite. It's full-time working, part-time student. Even though you guys are actually full-time students too. Most of you work full-time, right?
Mhm.
You all work full-time? Okay. All right. So, and it's hard. It's doable, but it's doable with difficulty, isn't it? So my point is, I'd like to life happens, and so there should be a makeup period. That's what I'm saying. So after the makeup period, I'll simply make the answers available so you can look at it and go from there. Okay. After the makeup period is over, and so you have 4 of those exams. We really only have 1 chance to take those, and I'll make those available. And you'll be able to see your score right away. Okay.
And the exam's hard.
Well, I think they're going to be something like, the exam's hard. No, they're super.
No, not like super easy, I know. But
I think they're challenging. What I usually do before every exam is I have a review session, the class session prior. And I usually allocate about a half an hour of the class session prior to going over what to look at on the exam. And because there's a lot, because in this class, we're basically taking a week or a semester, or condensing it into 7 weeks. So it's basically double time. So there's a lot going on. And usually I do 4 exams in 15 weeks. We're only doing 2 in 7. So there's a lot going on. So, what you're not going to see, I can promise you this, is you're not going to see some weird question about, some meaningless article like, something about should I-20, there's an article in the text about should I-20, I could care less, right? That's not what's going to be on the exam. It'll be something relevant to what's happening. And we will discuss, and nothing will be on an exam that we will not discuss in class. So it won't be some weird factoid from page 197 that we won't talk about here. Okay? And if for some reason the exam question slips in, you say, hey, you didn't talk about that in class, then well, I'll credit you back that. But I try hard not to let that happen. Okay. All right. Pardon?
do you allow notes?
Yes, you can use your notes. And I'll let you know whether you can take it Brightspace or not. Quizzes are definitely going to be a Brightspace. I just don't know what we're doing now that you guys are back, because we haven't been back. This is the first in classroom fast track class we've had since 2019. I think. Yeah. So I think toward the very end of 2019, because when did the pandemic set in? 2020, wasn't it?
2020.
But I think, what did we do on that? I can't remember what we did. Did we go straight to, well, you weren't here, so it doesn't matter. I forget what we did. I know that the classes we had in the classroom, we just simply flipped everybody to Brightspace. And I know that a lot of faculty had never liked online classes to begin with. They were, freaking out and all that. So, but that's okay. It doesn't take much to get faculty members to freak out about something. So, okay. So the syllabus is in the Brightspace site. That's you can download it, you can print it, you can do whatever you like, and so you should be good to go as far as that goes. So, any other questions? Anything I forgot to mention that is pertinent, or do you have questions about?
That last exam obviously is listed till 12/11.
Right. That's the very last day.
Our graduation is on the 9th.
Right. I know. Right. I know. And and believe me, it has happened where people haven't passed this course. It usually doesn't happen just because they failed that last. Usually there's something going on with that student, and it's not frequent. In fact, I don't think we've been doing this for a while. I think I've only had a couple of students who have not passed this course in their entire program. Once you get to this point, you pretty much know what's going on, don't you? I mean, and you want to get done. I mean, you would burn someone's house down to finish, right? I mean, you would. Don't do that, please. I mean, you would do a lot to make it happen, get done. So it's probably not going to happen. It's very rare that it does happen at this point, but it has happened. Yeah, so, but I do know that that's that Friday. In fact, we have some sort of, are we meeting in person now? I think we are. Right? So
Yeah.
it's the first time we've done that in a while, because we've done that, we did that for a time on Zoom, and that was a party on Zoom. Wow. I mean, it's bad enough it's a party on campus without alcohol, right? So, you know.
So yeah, maybe after thinking about it, maybe being open with the material might be good. Just so that
Okay.
that those dates are kind of
Why don't I
related.
open it? Okay, and give me a few, give me maybe until the weekend to do that, because it does take a while to sort of sort that stuff around and update it and make things current and whatnot. And so, yeah, give me a few days and I'll put that together for you. But I will, I'll put that so you can have that. And if you don't want to work ahead, don't work ahead. That's fine. Oh, by the way, in Brightspace, so I know that a lot of times the weekly modules, which you get to by going to coursework content, and you'll see the weeks on the left of the screen here, they usually don't contain the discussions. That's under a separate link. It's under the same main coursework, but there'll be discussions, there'll be 2 down. Some instructors will embed that within the course module. I put them all together on the same page, mostly because, you know, it's easier if you want to go back and say, hey, did somebody reply to me? Rather than have you go back to an earlier module and try to dig through that, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that does make sense, but it's the way I've sort of done that. So if you really want to see everything that's due for that week within that coursework content area, I can do that. But I usually sort of separate the discussions. You know, they're easy to find. You won't have any difficulty finding it.
We'll post the weekly Zoom videos that we record on. In Brightspace.
If I'm able to do that, I will. Yeah, if I'm able to, yeah, for sure. What I usually do is, and of course, I was doing it strictly via Zoom for a couple of years, and then I would save them and sort of compress them. I would just upload them to YouTube. So everybody's able to use YouTube, and you can. The great thing about YouTube is obviously, you know, if you got 10 minutes, you're waiting for the dentist, you can, you know, if you want to do that. I mean, you're already at the dentist, it's already bad, so you might as well you might as well take 10 minutes and listen to some econ. But it's there, it's available, you can rewind, stop, back up, all that good stuff. So we're all familiar with YouTube, and I've got my own channel, so I can simply upload it to that. That should be fine. I don't think there's any prohibition from doing that, so I think that's fine to do. So okay, I think that I have covered everything that I want to cover as far as that goes. Any other questions for me that I can answer? Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So I know that, has anybody had these out before outside of state high school?
Yes.
Okay, is that better? There's like a middle. Well, I guess
There's probably
guess
in
that's
the
as
middle.
I kind of like it kind of looks a little bit better, especially on video, and it's a little bit dimmer, but I guess that's as good as it's going to be. So, anybody take an econ like in a college setting before?
Yes.
You have taken econ. Okay, so so if you have, that's good. Now I know that most have not, and that's understandable. And my approach to this is this: I'm going to make the assumption that no one's ever had any econ whatsoever. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. At the beginning, I think that's the best way to start, is to talk about, you know, econ from the very beginning. We'll sort of build our way up tonight, and then also into next week. It's going to be probably maybe up until the first half of next week's class session. A lot of the material is foundational material that's common to both micro and macro. Obviously, this class is going to focus on macro only, but they sort of track together. And a lot of students will take in the regular classes, they'll take macro at the same time as they're trying to get into Anderson School or whatever. And in the first 3 weeks, they'll say, hey, it's all the same. Are you sure these are different classes? It's like, I'm sure they will break off and go different directions. And that's what we're going to do. But that break period is going to come sometime next week. And so there is a bit of difference. And so if you go on, I say this only because if you take a micro course in a bachelor's program somewhere, for those of you who are, you're going to see that a lot of the same thing again, because it's foundational material. Okay, so anyway, to start from the very beginning, I'm just going to ask the very simple question: what is economics? And I don't think it gets too much more basic than that. What is economics? So the answer, so that's the question. The answer is it's a social science dealing with choices made under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. So this is a true boilerplate textbook definition of what econ is about. But there are a couple of things we should talk about and to break this sentence up. And that's first of all, this idea of choices. And we're going to talk a lot about this idea that there is a lot of agency involved in all the economic actors, the actors whom we'll define here in a bit, and the choices they can make. And free markets allow people to make free choices. It also allows our government to make free choices. And we're going to certainly see that sometimes government doesn't always get it right. That's a shocking conclusion, but sometimes government does make a mess of things. And so even government can make mistakes. And it's because of the fact that not only are we dealing with scarcity, but also uncertainty. I think this is really an important issue, an important aspect of our understanding of economics, is we don't know what we don't know. And I mean, I think back to the housing and banking crisis at the beginning of 2007, 2008, 2009. And I don't think anybody really saw banks, big banks failing, JP Morgan having trouble, Citibank maybe going under, and a lot of big banks that no longer exist within the top 10 banks in the country, banks like First Union and Wachovia. These are big banks, and that those actually did go under and were absorbed by the banks. But not a lot of people saw it coming. So there's a lot that we don't know, and that's really the trouble. And I know that President Bush had a defense secretary a few years ago who made the statement, there are known knowns and there are known unknowns. Because you sort of widely parodied by, the late night comics. There are known knowns, there are known unknowns, but the unknown unknowns is the real trouble. And I know it sounds like a little bit of double talk, but what is he really saying? He's saying that the trouble is we don't know what we don't know. And that's the trouble. There are things we know we don't know, but there are also things that we don't know that we don't know it. Does that make sense? Or does it sound like I'm smoking crack here? So it's what we don't know. And I think it's very common. It's a very common set of conditions. By the way, the Great Depression was primarily, it started out as a banking crisis and a financial crisis that probably would have cured itself, but the government made mistake after mistake after mistake, did all the wrong things, but they thought they were doing the right things. They just didn't know what they didn't know. And they compounded and it was one cascading set of failures, primarily brought on by government failure. And I think that we need to be clear that sometimes the government does get it wrong. Now, scarcity is, a lot of times you'd see textbooks and would sort of put the period here where it's under scarcity. And the idea that it's dealing with choices made under conditions of scarcity. But I sort of include this uncertainty piece because I think it's an important thing for us to be aware of, is the idea that there are things that are not known. And frankly, I was still, I think up until I left bank. I was in banking for a lot of years. And I taught part-time for a lot of years while I was still full-time in banking. And I know that I had grown up, I started banking in the mid-80s. And I had come to believe that banks had really figured out all the problems that were existing around the time of the Great Depression, and that there's no possible way we could have a series of bank failures. Impossible, right? And the fact that we were all sort of led to believe that, but that didn't happen. We had lots and lots of bank failures and cascading problems. And had the government not gotten in there and dealt with it, we would have had another depression, not a recession. And we'll define what a recession is next week. But a depression, which is a deep, dark problem in the economy of high unemployment, high low growth rate, or usually negative growth, and usually due to something structural that's broken. Something structural is broken. And so the thing that we should know is one thing that I heard my very first day of banking that I have never forgotten. And at the time I thought, okay, it's a little bit of hyperbole on the first day, my first day of banking, but we were addressed by a senior executive who said that a bank is a house of cards. And that is, a bank is no more stable than the ability to prop it up with popsicle sticks of regulation. And that's all it really is, that you can just simply knock it down. Now, so what would happen if every depositor wanted his or her money out? Every depositor. What would happen? Because
You really don't have it
it's
invested.
not there. Your money's not there. It's not like in a shoebox with your name on it, right? So your money's not there. It's been loaned out, it's been invested, it's just not there. And in fact, if it's been invested, maybe in say the bond market or whatever, that money may even actually be gone. They still have a liability they owe back to, but it doesn't work. The system doesn't work. Likewise, what if we all decide that we as consumers want to go on strike? So let's just say that we're mad at, let's just say Albuquerque is its own little economy and nothing comes in, nothing leaves, and we're all mad at businesses. We're all anti-business screens. So we're just to say for the next month, no one's going to buy gas, no one's going to buy groceries. We're just going to eat cats and grass and walk to work, and we're probably not going to go to work, are we? But we're going to show them, right? What would happen immediately? What would happen? Inventory would stack up on shelves. We get layoffs. Nobody have wages. Nobody have spending. That's assuming you get everybody to do it. I mean, I realize the scenario is a little bit atrocious, but it could happen. By the way, there are cases in which people don't go shopping because maybe war is going on or pandemics or whatnot. My brother-in-law was in China when the coronavirus first began. That's where it began. It was in China. He was living in an apartment building. He could not leave the building for a while. So I think he had to prove it. He had to get a test, and then they had to wait a couple of days for the test to come back, and then he had to. It was really, he got out of China as quickly as he could, just because of the fact that I can't live this way. And China, by the way, is still under COVID lockdown in a lot of particular cases. So there are cases in which economies break down. They break down. So the system is fragile. I think that really is the message we want to give is economies are fragile. And if you don't believe it, then what happened in 2008 should let us know that it is fragile. Okay. All right. So sort of pick up on the sort of the textbook part of the scarcity. I know all these are in your week one module, and I know that sometimes people attach a little bit more importance to the PowerPoint slides than what they really are valuable for. It's mostly just so that they kind of guide the discussion. I don't know that there's a lot of things that are going to be pulled out of these on exams and quizzes, but they do sort of guide things and sort of keep me on track as much as anything. And as we get deeper into the class, I'll bring in some other materials as well, and maybe even some videos of some things if it's helpful to understand. I'll just simply post those within the links. And so when I make them, I'll make things available, and I'll probably keep adding to the class over time. So let's talk about scarcity. It's the definition of the dictionary is the quality or state of being scarce. Not particularly helpful as a definition, is it? However, I like this definition in quantity or number compared with the demand. I like that because uses economic terminology. So scarcity is really the heart of what's going on. Now, keep in mind, we have already made the case that the economies are fragile, they're unstable, they're wobbly, and they've got to be managed to the best that is possible, which is sometimes not always possible. But the very fact of scarcity though means if we didn't have scarcity, we wouldn't have economics at all. It wouldn't exist because we wouldn't have a need for any kind of economic system whatsoever. So, but this gives rise to the reason we have economics as a discipline is because we've got this, what's called the economizing problem. And I think this is discussed in your book as well. It's the conflict between unlimited wants and the reality of scarce resources. Unlimited wants and the reality of scarce resources. Now, here's a question that I want to put to all of you, and that's this. And that's this issue of unlimited wants. And also, and sort of maybe modify that by first talking about wants versus needs. And wants are those things that we just simply want to have, and needs are things that we have got to have. So what about needs? What are the things we've got to have? Food and shelter and water and maybe gasoline. Maybe gasoline. Yeah, it's probably a good point. Maybe healthcare. I don't know. I mean, depends on who you ask. Healthcare is complicated, isn't it? Because we don't have a system where people are assured of healthcare, unlike most of the rest of the industrial world, where if you need a doctor, you go see a doctor, and it's paid for out of your taxes. Here, we're not quite there yet at all. And it's very controversial. So those are the things we need. So do we pretty much have these licked, these needs? Have we gotten there pretty much? Okay. Okay. I would agree with that. I would agree with that for the most part, which is not to say that there aren't people in the world who die of starvation still, and dehydration, and bug bites and scratches that get infected. That does happen. That's unfortunate. No question about it. But in the industrial world, the modern world, we pretty much have this done. And by the way, when I say I agree, is there support for the idea that we're really on to these guys here? And the answer is yes. And the answer, and the reason why is the overwhelming majority of the value of the stuff that we make is wants, right? It's things that we want. Yes, I know we spend a lot on housing, and yes, we spend a lot on healthcare, but the majority of things are not things we have to necessarily have. Even things like education, I'm not even sure that we have to have education. Sounds like a strange comment coming from somebody who does this for me, but I think it's mostly that it mostly goes into the sort of the wants category. And we could argue about some of which goes into which category. That's not really my point. But we're really on to sort of this. It's all the stuff. It's the satellite TV. It's the the clothing and all kinds of clothing. It's the expensive vehicles. It's the trips to Disney World. It's the yada yada yada. It's the NFL package on it's all that. And so we're really on to that now. And so one assumption is that our wants are unlimited. Now, what do you think about that statement? Are our wants unlimited? Is that an outrageous statement? Can that be supported, or should that be challenged? Do you think our wants are unlimited? They are unlimited? Okay, that they go on and on and on. Or will we ever get to the point where we say, oh, okay, well then I'm happy. I'm really happy. I'm really happy economically. Well, first of all, not too many people are happy economically. And even people with lots and lots of financial resources are not always happy economically. And one of the things I learned early on in my career as a banker, working with very wealthy clients, is what do they always want? They wanted more. By the way, what was the thing that terrified them most? More than cancer, more than getting arrested for something, it was what? Being sued by somebody who wanted to take their stuff, right? That was the thing. Losing what they've got, that was the thing that terrified them the most. And what they wanted was more. What they always wanted was more. And to the point where, of course, you have a gap between somebody who just started right out of college and somebody who's a multimillionaire is quite substantial. And it's tempting for us to look at it and say, how much do you need that for? By the way, well, the answer is more. The answer is more. Now I know, and I'll say this, and I'll throw one more thing at you before I move on. I'm a little provocative here, but only because the fact that this is what econ is about. It's about thought-provoking questions and about uncomfortable questions, and about the fact that economics is, no matter what we say, a controversial subject. And when we get into economic policy, we'll really get into controversial subjects because there's no real right answer, okay? President Biden wants to raise taxes on the highest income earners. If you earn over $400,000 a year, President Biden wants to tax those people more. Is that fair or is that unfair? There's no right answer, is there? What answer are you going to give? Probably whichever one affects you. If you're Elon Musk says, that's not fair, man. I worked my butt off to get where I am. Why should I pay more in taxes? All this, right? Whereas people who are looking up at 400,000 will say, that's fair. Yeah, that's definitely fair. Now, President Biden thinks that is a fair statement. Now, is there a right or wrong answer? No, there's no right or wrong answer. And President Biden won't be president forever. A new president will come along, probably want to cut taxes on those earning more. So it goes up, it goes down, changes, it goes around. And it's because of the fact that there's not any universal truth as to what should be in economics. So we're going to get to these shoulds here a bit later. Okay. But one thing that in terms of being provocative and we're not trying to push buttons in order just to push them, but it's this idea of unlimited wants and whether or not they're truly unlimited. I think they pretty much are. Because think about this. When I was a little kid, my grandmother was many years older than me, and she remembers polio. And so we would go swimming at a pool, and she'd go, it's really dangerous to go swimming. It's how you get polio. Because that used to be how you got polio when people used to swim in what? Rivers, right? Well, we weren't going to a river, we were going to a municipal pool with chlorine. And it's like, it's with lifeguards, it's safe, it's fine, right? But she still in her head, this is how you get polio, right? So polio is not even a thing anymore, really, is it? So did we stop doing medical research once polio was figured out? Or do we move on to the next thing? We've moved on, right? We've moved on, and we're going to keep moving on to the next thing all the time. And one other thing, this is the last thing before we move on to this whole business about, we'll get a little bit more deeply into class. And that's when I was coming up as an undergraduate student in economics, I had professor after professor say, that he goes, one way to understand human behavior economically is to assume that people are greedy. And those are my words, those are my professor's words, is to assume that people are greedy. And, you know, at the time, I didn't really like that statement very much. And I didn't agree with it. And I will say today, even though I've gone on about unlimited wants, I still don't know that I agree with it. And I'm not here to say what the right answer is and what's wrong, but is there a difference between greed and self-interest? If so, what is the difference?
Self-interest is doing what's best for you.
Right.
Greed is probably doing what's best for you by any means necessary.
That's pretty
any like expense for anybody else.
right. So your gain, even if it comes at someone else's expense, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because it is possible to be just self-interested, right? And by the way, if you act in your own self-interest, is it even possible sometimes to know whether or not you're disadvantaging somebody else? I don't know that that's the case at all, right? So, you know, I don't know that that's the case. If you do something, you know, for instance, you want to buy a house and somebody slid in before you, got a purchase offer in, right? And it sounds like, oh gosh, I missed out on the house. The realtor calls next day and says, oh, they backed out. You know, if you want the house, you better sign it. So anytime you're pushing somebody else out, do you feel bad about doing that? I mean, necessarily. I mean, I don't know that that's. Do you know that you're pushing somebody out? I don't know that that's the case. So I think your definition of greed versus self-interest makes a lot of sense. Greed could be cutting corners, doing things really on the edge of ethics in order to get ahead. But I think most of us have a self-interest. And I think that is human nature to have self-interest. By the way, I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of the socialist economies in the world haven't done very well. And by the way, if they were going to do well, they would have already done well. But none of them have done well. None of them.
A really good example of it is, you know, as we started in the pandemic and then all of a sudden there's toilet paper shortage.
Yeah.
And then there's people taking advantage of the shortage and buying and have truckload full and selling it at much higher.
Selling out their car, putting it on eBay, selling these Clorox wipes on eBay, you know. I mean, yeah, people were doing that. Was kind of crazy.
And in some cases, they ended up in hot water with the law.
Oh, did they? No, I don't
Yeah,
hear
there
that.
was a couple guys got in trouble.
Yeah. Well, I remember on September 11th, right, the day of the terrorist attacks. I was living in Indianapolis at the time, and I know that like just a couple hours after the terrorist attacks, gasoline went sky high, just like an afternoon. It went, whatever it was, let's say it was $2.50 a gallon, it went up to like $4.50 a gallon. Just for that day, you had people with gas lines and all that. And the governor said, we are going to prosecute people for doing that. And it turns out that, I mean, the gasoline prices on their own fell, but it turns out the attorney general said, no, there's nothing illegal about raising the price of gasoline. There's no law against gouging. If you want to pay, if you want to charge $5 a gallon and somebody was willing to pay it, that's your business, right? Just like if they want to pay a baseball player, you know, $400 million over 11 years, that's their business. If you want to pay, you know, like Fernando Tatis, I mean, what is it, $400 million contract? How many games does he play actually, right? Well, never mind. Nobody watches baseball. Everybody's like, ooh, what?
Yeah, he's suspended.
Well, now he's suspended, right?
Yeah.
And they needed it.
I don't think he's being paid here.
Oh, is he not? Okay,
No, probably not.
that's good. I say for that, but I know nobody watches baseball anymore. So what? Who are you talking about? So, right. So, but you get the idea. So I think there's a difference between greed and self-interest. So I don't know that I really like that. But then again, I know a lot of instructors and a lot of economists believe that greed is one way to explain human behavior. And I don't know if that's really so much the case because I think there are plenty of places in the economy that we can exercise our greed, and that people just refrain from doing it. By the way, one other aspect of this would be this: if we only were economic beings, and all we did was live to gain at the expense of everything else, then we would all have 3 jobs, and we wouldn't sleep ever, we wouldn't take any vacations, we wouldn't spend money, we'd buy generic stuff, right? We would all do what we like. But I think most of us like to come home and spend money on stuff, right? And take a vacation and relax the other day, right? So I don't think we are purely economic beings, but I do think economics is a part of the picture. which is why it's still considered a social science. So we talk about the solution. We say the free market system is really the solution. It is a rationing system. It's a rationing mechanism is what the market system is. Because we've got scarcity, we have to ration resources. We can't have all that we want to have. So as a result, and by the way, there's a lot of interesting research in macro that's been going on for decades about the fact that these actors change roles over time. And there's something called the lifetime earnings function, which goes along with something called the lifetime consumption function. And that is that our earnings and our consumption patterns change over time, right? And so, and we change roles. And so think about this, I'm probably, well, maybe I'm at the peak of my earning power, I don't know. Because I'm eligible to retire in 3 years, right? I don't want to retire, I think I'm healthy enough and all that, but I can probably retire. So I had to switch roles with my mother, right? Who's retired now, she's passed on, right? And my son will be coming in, he'll be entering his peak earning power. And so his role will change over time. So we sort of change roles. And so the system though allocates. So in your peak earning years, you have a lot more choices. As your income begins to fall in retirement, your choices begin to go down. Your choices become constrained. And so we're free to the extent that we're free and unhindered to do what we want, but there are some practical realities. I had an aspiration to play professional baseball when I was younger. Played baseball through high school and college. As it turns out, I was pretty sure I was never going to be a pro baseball. Could I have worked a little harder to maybe make that happen? Yeah, maybe. I doubt it. I doubt it. It is. Yeah, I probably had a better chance of becoming an acrobat than a pro baseball player. So but I was free to do that. I was free to pursue that. So one final thing, and we'll sort of get into some other stuff. Oh, by the way, I usually take a break around, say 6:45-ish, something like that. Does that sound about right to everybody? Maybe take a break, and maybe 5 till top of the hour, that sort of thing, and then that usually is that usually acceptable to you?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Some instructors, I've been in classes, 3-hour classes, and instructors didn't give a break at all. When I was in graduate school, in the PhD program, we had an instructor who didn't let us go at all, ever. So everybody would get like a Coke, and Pepsi, and tea, and water, and load up and make sure the phone was charged, and go to the bathroom and smoke a cigarette, and then all their stuff down because they're getting locked in for 3 hours. But obviously you're not prisoners. You're free to move around. You're also not on an airplane, so you're free to move around. So. All right, so what is a market? We're going to start talking, particularly next week, we're going to sort of do the building blocks of markets. The best definition of a market is organized means by which people exchange value. And so we are going to talk about this idea of how markets are organized from the standpoint of demand and supply. These are terms that are familiar to everybody, and we're going to sort of take these from the ground up and sort of build them. And then once we do that, we're going to sort of then blow that up and expand it to talk about the entire economy. The entire macro economy, and how it is more than just simply a collection of markets. It's a little bit more than that. It includes some things that don't get covered in what we call microeconomics, which is essentially the study of markets. Okay, but we'll talk about exchange of value. By the way, we talk about exchanging value. What is the value of something? And that's a very generic question. The value of something is what somebody's what. And by the way, isn't that the same definition that we use in the accounting world, financial world? What's the value of a piece? What's the value of this computer? Well, the value of the computer is what we were willing to pay for, right? And also what somebody was willing to accept for it. So that must be what the value of it is. There's no other better representation of value than what we call an arm's length transaction of unrelated parties who agree this is what the price ought to be. And if they don't agree, then there's no sale. Happens all the time, doesn't it? Even though in our economy, we do not have necessarily a bartering type system in our economy. And by barter, what do I mean by it? Well, not bartering in the sense of I'll cut your grass if you rake my leaves. I'm talking about our bargaining, I guess is really the word I mean. We really don't bargain for things, do we? What would happen? And some societies do, right? And I was in I think I was in Mexico, and I was going through some place, and my wife's cousin is from Mexico, I bought a pair of sunglasses, and he asked me how much I paid, and I said, $8. I thought it was a pretty good deal. He goes, oh, I bet you're gonna get 5, 4, 5. He goes, did you bargain? And I go, no, I didn't bargain. What? You're supposed to haggle. You can get that at a lower price. Well, I'm not used to doing that, because what happens if you walk into Walgreens and see sunglasses, $8, and you go to the manager and say, I'm gonna be fine.
You say no and put it back on the shelf.
What's he gonna say to you? I'll give you 5 for the sunglasses. He'll say, well, $8. And he's sorry, $5.50. It's $8. And okay, look, $6.25 and I'm done. I walk out that door at $6.25, take it or leave it, going once, going twice.
$8 is fine.
How's that whole encounter gonna end? You're gonna probably end up in handcuffs, right? You probably, I mean, very likely. I mean, because you're causing trouble. You're making trouble by trying to bargain for the price of something. And by the way, it would make sense to, because what if everybody went to Walgreens and bargained over Pop-Tarts and Cheetos and tobacco and every single good? You go to McDonald's, $4.50 for a Big Mac, you're out of your mind. I'll give you $2.75. Right? It doesn't work that way. So it's take it or leave it, right? If I don't like the price of a Big Mac, I go, right? I take it or leave it. Now, in some ways, I think this is a weakness of our economy that we don't really flex our muscles in terms of bargaining, because there's really no incentive to do it. In fact, there are practical reasons why we shouldn't do it, because we'll look like a lunatic by doing it every time we do it. But there are societies in the world in which that's much more pronounced. In fact, this is why I think a lot of people are very bad bargainers when it comes to dealing with markets and exchanging value, because there are really only 2 goods that we do any kind of bargaining over on a routine basis. And houses. That's really it. Those are the 2 biggest purchases that you make, right? And that's really all you bargain for. So it's difficult. Now, one other thing about this that I should talk about is the fact that this is also, I'm being a little bit facetious when I say maybe it's a good idea to go bargain for sunglasses at Walgreens. Also, the other issue that we've got is that we're in a very complicated economy. And a lot of the goods that we have to rely upon experts to explain how the heck they work. And we just simply take their word for it that this is what's going on. So I go to the doctor says, I'm going to change your medication. I've got asthma. And he goes, I'm going to change your medication around. Do I say, you know what? I don't agree with you. I think, where do you get that? I mean, explain. I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't mind if I asked a little bit of questions, right? But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of his time doing that, because it's going to be, you know what, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to, if you don't want this, that's fine. I'll keep you on. I'll note your chart. They call your file your chart, right? This is what you're doing, right? So, but am I going to argue with my doctor that this is what I need? Maybe he's wrong even. I mean, he could be actually wrong. They've been known to happen, right? But I really don't. I'm going to rely on experts. One other thing, we talked about this idea of bargaining for the most expensive goods in our economy. Think about something like this. Think about retirement. So I'm a public employee working at CNN. So we get these pension statements. And I kind of like to think I'm a pretty smart person, pretty financially savvy and whatnot. I went to college for 10 years. I should be able to figure this out, right? I'm looking, I'm thinking, I don't get this. I don't understand it. If I don't understand it, how does anybody else understand it? What's going on? I mean, you're talking about actuarial present value of future cash flows, depending upon your life expectancy, and those in your cohort from the day you started, since you were born after 1960. Yeah, I mean, it just went on and on and on and on and on, and it's just like, what? I don't. So we've got to really rely upon experts in order to help us understand these things. Because in the old days, and in a lot of what we call classical economic thinking that derived from the very first economic transactions, it was the idea that I could bargain with somebody for the price of something, and we could agree upon what that good was. This is a horse, and so I can just take a look at that horse that's reasonably healthy. Okay, or it's an iron skillet, right? Nothing too complicated about iron skillet, or a saddle, or a rake, or something like that, or a bag of seed. Well, today the products are complicated, MRIs, and and foreign travel, and retirement planning, and all these kinds of things. So it's a more complicated world. So as a result, we've got to rely a lot on experts, and that's part of the challenge I think we've got to deal with in markets is we've got to be able to work out who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. Okay. All right, so questions about that. Real quickly, and then we'll take a short break here. So we really got two branches of econ. I sort of alluded to this before, and you may be familiar with this on your own for the most part. Econ itself is broken into two branches, micro and macro. Having said that, if you took this class 100 years ago, prior to the Great Depression, in other words, all econ was primarily micro. And to the extent that macro topics were included in it, they're basically included in the context of micro. And that was the idea that an economy was simply the sum of its parts. Today, we look at the economy as being something different than the sum of its parts. It's got the macroeconomy itself is sort of its own beast. And by the way, the variables that we study are far different in macroeconomics than what they are in microeconomics. Okay. If we talk about macroeconomics, for instance, the total output of the U.S. economy this year is going to be somewhere around, we'll take the inflation adjusted number. It's going to be somewhere, it's going to be higher than this, but it's going to be close. Around this many zeros, right? That's this year. And then we'll do the same next year, $23 trillion this year. And then we'll start over next year. Maybe it'll be higher, maybe it'll be lower. You could easily live your entire life without ever seeing a number that big, right? Or maybe you never want to see a number that big, right? So you kind of get the idea. It's a pretty good sized number. Let's just, if we rounded this down a little bit and say, okay, what if it's 21 trillion? And let's say that we say there are 300 million of us, right? Or more like 330 million of us. But that, if you do the division of that, that is $70,000 of output per person. Of output per person. And that's every person. That's people who are 6 months old and don't work. I misspelled person. Spelling's not right. Person's gonna know. About $70,000 of output per person. That includes infants, includes retirees, disabled people, people behind bars, all that. So, in other words, a family of four, their share of the economy ought to be about $280,000. Right? Does that sound like a typical family of four? Probably not. So what does that immediately tell you with these big numbers in economics, very large variables, right? Now, if you just do the math, I know I'm reducing these numbers to make the math easy. I get that. But what is this? What is this telling us? Just a quick and dirty look. If this tells us that what there is inequality, inefficiency, inequality, right? There's inequality, and in other words, now I realize that some of this goes off in the form of taxes, some of it goes in the form of corporate profits. I realize that. We'll get to that. But what I'm saying is, though, that even if you took those out, which are a smaller portion, by the way, we don't really pay that much in taxes. I mean, I know that we're led to believe, especially this. By the way, I'm ready for the election to be over. I'm just, you can't even turn on the TV's unwatchable these days. So, yeah. I got a 5-year-old. I got a 5-year-old who says, Mark Ron Kenny will make our neighborhood safer. It's like, what are you doing? And it's like, well, first of all, he didn't like Mark Ron Kenny. Now he's for Ron Kenny. It's like, well, he's like, yeah, vote, right? You're about as educated as every other voter. So, so he was against Ron Kenny before he was for. But so there's inequality going on, right? And what is more concerning about this is what is the inequality of distribution of income getting more fair or less fair over time? Less even, right? Or less, maybe even more fair kind of implies a making judgment. So it's less even. So we're becoming a more unequal society. And this is a big issue in economics right now. And we're going to hear much more about it, particularly if, as I suspect, we are on the brink of a recession. I think if we're not in a recession already, I think we're almost there. We're already starting to see signs of that happening. We'll talk much more about that. I think that we are probably in a recession. So, but we don't know because it takes a little bit of time for the data to come in. And one of the things about economics, especially macro, we've got big variables, but then they're all historical variables. It's all in the past, just a little bit, right? So one of the things that will come up again and again in this course is this metaphor about driving the car. As a policymaker, you're driving the car, and the metaphor is you're driving the car by looking in the rear view mirror, because all the information you've got is historical information. There is very little real-time information going on in economics. About the only real time that we call what we call coincident indicators are things that are like weekly help wanted ads that they used to get to look at newspapers. Today, where do they get help wanted ads? On job sites, right? They look on job sites and they find out what the trends are in that. Also, people applying for unemployment. If you're applying for unemployment, you have to keep filing every week. But other than that, it's all old data. So we talk about micro versus macro. There is that difference, is that the variables are different. We're talking about big numbers. And that's just the US economy. We haven't included China and European and all that. We used to have a textbook in a course that I teach called Survey of Economics. It's a very beginning level course. It doesn't get very technical. And I thought it had one of the best descriptions of the distinctions between this. Beyond the small picture view and big picture was that the small picture view of the economy, that micro is more street level economics. I always like that definition. It's walking along the street and see individual businesses employing individual workers, selling individual goods for individual prices, the workers receiving their own individual wages and turning it into additional spending, right? And that was sort of street level economics. In fact, micro has sort of been described as where we live. Most of us are living in the micro world, and the macro world is just sort of out there and it maybe takes care of itself. But it's a study of individual items. That I kept saying the word individual here. And so we say it's the study of markets. You got these subfields, labor and all that. We're not really going to get very much into this after about midway through class next week. Macro is the big picture. So if this is the street level, this is the view from outer space. We're looking at the entire economy, including the global economy. And so it's different. And to say that macro, which used to be the view of macro, before macroeconomics was even a term that was coined sometime around the 1940s, would be to say that all macro is simply a collection of all individual markets is really not right, because there are other things going on, including the fact we study things like the money supply, which we don't study at all on micro. We're going to study the money supply, international trade, which is kind of overlaps a bit. We'll talk about business cycles, which we don't study in micro at all. So there are things that we talk about that we don't talk about there. Tax policy, particularly things like income taxes. Income taxes has almost nothing to do with micro whatsoever. Okay, so that's sort of the distinction between those two. And we're going to sort of touch on the economics of markets here for just a little bit. And then we'll get into macro. And so sometime middle of class next week, it'll be all macro all the time. Okay. All right. So questions for me before we take a break? Are we ready for a break? I think we are. Okay. Let's take a break. We'll come back here and maybe a couple minutes or so after 7. We'll pick it back up. I'll pause the recording again.
Nice work. I hope it's a flip book. Couple words flash up.
Okay. Okay, I think we're back, right? We're back. Okay, so I'm recording again.
All night.
Is I
I was like, I bet. She was in
And
here.
the stock go down. And then he had to buy it. He said
What I think I'll probably do in the video is I'll probably, it usually takes a bit of time to sort of compress and upload. When you compress it to an MP4 file, I'll probably do that tomorrow sometime. Usually it takes about a half an hour. And I know that security likes to run people out here about 8:30 or so. So what I'll do is I'll just email you the link to YouTube. Is that all right? So, okay, so I'll just do that. And because I don't think you can save, I don't think it saves within the cloud on Brightspace. I think I heard that we just don't have enough space for that. So I just started uploading it to YouTube, and YouTube seems like it's got a practically infinite amount of storage. I've got hundreds of hours of videos in my YouTube channel. So I'll just do that, but it'll be tomorrow. Okay. That's sort of okay. All right. So I think we're back, and we've got about another hour-ish to go. So I want to do this. I want to just cover this real briefly and then move on to talking about factors of production. We'll start to really get into where we're going here. The big thing I want to talk about in this slide about what do economists do, and I don't mean for this to be a self-serving sort of discussion, but it is a reality that there really aren't very many practicing economists in the country today. In fact, I think I've read consistently that there are more neurosurgeons than there are economists, which I think is a pretty astounding fact, to be honest with you. But I have had students, having done this a while, I've had students who have gone on to graduate school and actually are practicing economists in some places. And so, but it's entirely possible you'll never meet an economist in your life, but me. Now, that'll be it. So this is, and in which case you might think they're lucky stars. I don't know. You know, because I know that there's a lot of disagreement over a lot of things, and we can't even agree on the same textbook for our department. So I mean, economists do disagree, and I know that President Truman always said he wanted a one-armed economist. Because they always said on one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand, on the other, you know, that sort of thing. So there is substantial disagreement. So what do we do? Teaching and research, obviously that's what I'm employed in doing, but there are opportunities in government, also business and consulting. Consulting is obviously part of the business world. And also advising political leaders. I think this is important. There have been lots of members of Congress who come from the economics profession. You know, Dick Armey, who was a major force in the House of Representatives a few years ago, Les Aspin, who was a member of the House of Representatives, but very few, no presidents that I'm aware of. And so we really can't expect presidents to have, or governors or really top officials, they have a lot of economic knowledge. And so there is a requirement. This is one of those places where expertise does come about. I remember my very first day as an econ graduate student, one of my professors said that we need to make sure our math is right. It sounds like a completely rational statement. You need to make sure our math is right. But the reason she said it is that in the real world, nobody's going to check your math. It's like, she's probably right. I mean, when's the last time you got your P&N bill? I thought, no, I don't think so. Started running the numbers, right? Does anybody do that?
There's a couple.
Have you?
There's very few random people. They will.
Really? You do that to the P&N bill?
Well, I work for water, but yeah,
Oh, they do. Okay.
they do.
All right.
Down to the
Well,
penny. Yep.
they're called people with too much time.
They'll argue it and then they want us to send them the formula of how we did it.
Oh, is that right? Oh, really? Oh, my gosh. Well, I think, and you are right about that, because I know when I was in banking, we occasionally had people wanting to know how we broke down principal and interest on loans that go on year after year after year. We
It's
print off
very rare. but it
large
happens.
activity statements. And part of the problem is that if you make a payment every due date, it's not going to post on the due date because the due date's full of holidays and Saturdays and all that. So maybe even before, maybe after. So interest keeps on rolling. It's never going to be exactly what people think it's going to be. But her point was that nobody's really going to be checking our math. And in fact, that is probably a more true statement than it is an untrue statement. And in fact, there was a famous case in economics a few years ago in which an economist named Romer at Harvard published a very important paper dealing with gross domestic product and federal debt, that is government borrowing. And a graduate student no less, at Andover, I think, or one of those schools, delved into it and found that there's a math error. Very embarrassing, but very unusual that anybody's really going to be checking the math. And so relying upon economists is oftentimes an important thing to do. And then the one thing that is that I want to spend time is talking about making pronouncements. And if the word pronouncements is too highfalutin for what we do, then how about statements? And there are really two forms of statements. One is a positive economic statement, and the other is a normative economic statement. These may be new terms to you, and so let's talk about what they are. But first of all, when we talk about a positive economic statement, the key thing that I want to point out here is that positive does not mean necessarily good news. It could be good news or it could be bad news. Instead, the term positive derives from an intellectual tradition called positivism, that came out of the Enlightenment, which is basically looking at the world in an objective and scientific way without any sort of metaphysical explanation for why things happen the way they happen. But this is the way it is. And so whether it's positive, whether it's good news or bad news. And I know some people get tripped up on the idea of positive statements by saying that it's all got to be good news. It could be actually quite bad news, right? For instance, if we said the unemployment rate is currently 8.5%, now it's not, but I'm just saying if it is, would that be good news or bad news? Well, I think it would depend upon who you ask. And by the way, there are no universal benchmarks for a lot of these data points. I can tell you that when I was an undergraduate in economics, we were coming off a pretty serious recession, and the unemployment rate had fallen from the entire economy had fallen from around 10 or 11% to about 7%. and then just sort of stopped falling. The unemployment rate stopped falling. So my last year of college, and I had a professor at the time saying that the macro profession was sort of under the impression that that is as good as it is going to get. 7% must be full employment because we can't get any better than that. This is where things are. Well, obviously we did better than that because throughout most of the 90s, 2000s, and this last decade, we were down around 4%. And today, most economists would say full employment is around 4 to 5%, let's say 4.5 to split the difference. So this is, so 7% is not etched in stone. 8.5 probably looks pretty good if 7 is the benchmark, but it looks pretty terrible if 4.5 is the benchmark. By the way, what is the unemployment rate right now in the country? Any idea? So it's around 3.7, something like that. Around 3.5 to 3.7. There are actually a number of different ways of measuring it, depending upon whether you include teenagers or not. Usually we cut teenagers out because they're hard to calculate. A lot of times they'll quit a job on a turn of a dime, you know, that type of thing.
New Mexico's 4.2.
It's yeah. New Mexico is always a little higher. New Mexico is always a little bit higher of an unemployment rate. It's always been that as long as I've lived here. So
US is 3.5.
3.5, yeah. So 3.5. So the unemployment rate. So if we say the unemployment rate is currently 8.5%, maybe that's good news, maybe that's bad news. But the point is, it is what it is, and the explanation is objective and measurable. And in and of itself, it's not controversial, even though maybe people don't want to hear certain things like unemployment rate 8.5. A normative economic statement is really where all the trouble begins, and that's a statement of what should be. And it's much more subjective, and it may be very definitely controversial. But here's the kicker: it also forms the foundation for policy. So if President Biden, just back to the example I used earlier, President Biden says the high-income people pay too little in taxes, right? And so his statement of what should be is higher income people should pay more taxes, right? Is that what the president believes, right? Okay, so that's what now, does everybody believe that, right? No, of course everybody doesn't believe that. There are a lot of people who believe that we all pay too much in taxes and that we should lower taxes across the board. I don't happen to be one of them, but there are people who believe that. So, but it is what it is. Now, and in terms of controversial, and in terms of forming policy, the most controversial policy that I can think of economically, that I could think of really for a long time, is President Obama's sort of rewiring of the healthcare system, which culminated in the Affordable Care Act. Now, it's been a while, but does everybody remember if that was controversial or not? Oh, yeah. Extremely. He was called a communist on the one hand, he was called a Nazi on the other hand, which I don't know, communists and Nazis, they didn't really get along, so I don't know how you call them both a communist. I mean, but that's how heightened the tensions got. And that's how hyperventilated the whole thing gets, particularly when it's a very controversial subject. And the historian Richard Hofstadter said that this is a feature of the American system, is that it's not just one thing to call your opponent wrong, you've got to call him a child molesting vampire or something. I mean, we just don't stop. We just got to go on and on and on. If everything's, he called it the paranoid style. And he said this like 80 some years ago. So as a result, it became controversial. But here's the thing, it became law, didn't it? So President Obama's statement, his positive economic statement is what? Every American, well, I guess normative statement, I'm sorry. So President Obama's, if you were to put that in a normative economic statement, well, let's go back up. Let's say, so 47 million Americans did not have health insurance. That would have been the positive economic statement. Not good news, but a statement. Okay, of fact and objective, measurable and whatnot. So President Obama's personal viewpoint was every American should have health insurance, right? And that was obviously very controversial. And so as a result, but it became the basis for policy. And, you know, I don't know why it was so controversial because, you know, and I think a lot of it is because a lot of corporations have not liked the idea. They've not liked the idea of the slippery slope. And once they start to lose control over healthcare, then the government gets involved. It is an article of faith among big business people that once the government gets involved, everything costs more. And as a result, once government started funding higher education started costing more. Once the government got involved in healthcare started costing more. That's the article of faith. Whether you agree with it or not, I'm just telling you that's the particular argument. So normative statements where all the trouble begins. And we will probably return again and again to talking about something as a normative statement. That this is the proposal for doing this, and it's the normative judgment of this person or these people who believe this should be the case and are opposed by these things. And so again, I had said at the outset of class today that a lot of economics is controversial only because it is what it is. Keep in mind that econ sort of flowed out as a sort of a breakaway academic discipline from political science about 140 years ago, 150 years ago. And political science obviously involves controversy and whatnot. Okay, so it is what it is. All right, so questions about that, what that's about. Okay, well, let's move on to, and let's get into some of the actual economics here. Now, we've covered some of the preliminary background material, and we want to talk a bit about factors of production. And in doing this, I don't know why this isn't advancing. Okay, there we go. So I want to talk about factors of production, and I'm going to draw a little model here, and you're going to think this is the most basic Fred Flintstone model I have ever seen in my life. And this is not Nobel Prize winning stuff, but what is the most basic activity in an economy from the supply standpoint? It is what? It's corralling all of these things out here that we simply call inputs. It's corralling together, it's operating into some process that we refer to as production. And then what happens with production is a creature of the unique business of the unique actor group called firms. And we shouldn't take the existence of firms for granted. In fact, there was a landmark work done in the 1930s called Economics of the Firm. And today it forms really the basis for understanding. And today we take business firms for granted, but it was a fairly new form of economic organization. That is, what is industrialization given us? It has resulted in a change to centuries-old patterns where we would work the land, we would work from home, we would travel around, we would follow livestock around as nomads. Well, firms, why is it called a firm? Because it's in place, right? And you leave home to go do what? To go to that place, right? And you go do your work. And I know that now a lot of us are working from home, and so I get that, but we're still not necessarily working for ourselves, we're working for somebody else. And what is being created are these nice shiny little boxes called outputs. Okay, and then outputs have a dollar figure attached to it. And the total value of all outputs is the total value of our entire economy. So it's the corralling of all of these inputs. And what are these inputs? Well, we can categorize them in 4 categories, and these are very old categories, by the way. Land, labor, and capital are the first 3 of these. In fact, I think probably sometime around the early 90s, this 4th one was added, entrepreneurial ability. And I suspect that was at the behest of business schools, who really are the customers of a lot of economics departments. The entrepreneurial ability was some sort of X factor that added to the original, and these are a couple centuries old, land, labor, and capital. So let's talk about these factors of production and what they are, to be specific. So when we say land, we're not talking about land as land per se, although it would include land. Instead, what we're really talking about here are natural resources. That is, things which come to us by virtue of our being on the same planet as those things. We don't have to go hunting for sunlight, it is there. There's no market for sunlight. I know there's a market for the byproduct of sunlight, which is solar power, but not for sunlight itself. And we're not competing over sunlight, right? Even if you go to the beach, right? Unless it's the most crowded beach ever, nobody's blocking your sunlight, right? There's beaches that are, it's close to that, but there's no blocking or wind or air is free. And water, for the most part, I know water is, it's obviously it's not quite the same as the other resources, but nonetheless, the price of water that we pay, the water company, is minuscule of what its value is to us. Am I right?
So water is free. What you pay for is getting it cleaned and sent to your house.
And sent to your
for
house.
convenience.
And getting people administering the
Yeah,
water.
we had to tell customers that because we
Right.
want people flip out on us.
Well, I don't even think it's that expensive to begin with. I mean,
It's not.
I mean,
It's
we don't
cheaper,
pay
it's
that.
way cheaper than.
I can't even
residential.
tell you what we pay. I don't know what my wife pays the water bill.
It's regulated, so like in the city of Albuquerque, you can't drill a well on your
Oh, really?
land.
Or you can't, I don't know.
No, if there's an
It used to
available
be up
water
to
line, you
their-
have to take
There are
it.
houses in our neighborhood, near Ridgecrest, there's a big house that has a well
Oh, really?
and it's grandfathered,
Yeah.
but it's pretty rare because they don't want everybody drilling a well.
Drilling their
into
own
our
wells.
aquifers.
Right. Oh, it's just sapping water, right? Otherwise, right. It's good. I thought everything was legal now. So, you know, murder was legal. I've got neighbors with lives. I got a guy across who's got sheep in the back of his house, and you know, I don't know if the authorities know he has sheep, but I hear them every day. So you know that's really so. But anyway, my wife's when she was my wife grew up here. So when she was a kid, I used to sell ice cream out of the ice cream truck, and I also sold marijuana out of the ice cream truck. So you know, and I hope that anybody ever heard that story. So she made that house. She pulled that way. Or is she?
There was that's the entrepreneurial ability.
That's the entrepreneurial ability. That's right. That's the entrepreneurial ability. So, and by the way, I know when when you talk about, I mean, this drug conversation has been one that we've been having a long time. In fact, it has been argued by economists for a very long time that all narcotics should be legalized. And we're not talking about wild party animals who are making a statement. The guy Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago was saying we should legalize heroin, we should legalize cocaine, we should legalize all of it. And that way, and if you get addicted, you get addicted. You know the risks. You know, you know, yeah, I mean, alcohol's legal. I mean, it's surprising alcohol's legal. Alcohol's pretty dangerous stuff. You know, I mean, it really is.
Well, they did attempt to ban it.
I'm a lot more worried about my kids drinking than I am smoking marijuana. I mean, I don't want them. I mean, I want them to be perfect angels. Cigarettes are why are cigarettes legal? Right? Cigarettes, if used properly, they'll kill you, right? But then
Those
again,
commercials are gone.
yeah, at least the commercials, as Joe Campbell's going, right? So, but he argued that we should legalize all that so that we can tax it and improve quality. Now, there's another argument though, and I thought it was interesting. And I had a student, this was a few years ago, before New Mexico moved to legalize recreational cannabis, and the student said, you know what, if we do that, what's going to happen is just going to be like what the narcotics business didn't get going in this country until alcohol was legalized. He's probably right about that. In fact, narcotics were legal. Coca-Cola famously used to have cocaine, right? Hence the name, right? But it really didn't become a business, an underground business, until alcohol became legal, because organized criminals were in the alcohol business because it was illegal. And so then that's when that became legal. There's more money in illegal stuff than there is illegal stuff. So his argument is if you now legalize marijuana and cocaine and all that, then we're going to move on. The criminals will find something else to do. And the next market he thought would be kidnapping. And kidnapping won't take off the world, which is pretty terrifying, right? That's one thing, you know. So I thought that was a really shocking, but I think sometimes people say things that just make you go, I just thought that was an interesting statement. So you wonder, maybe we should legalize certain things just to have a black market and just to keep criminals occupied, maybe, you know? And I mean, they're going to break the law anyway, right? I don't know. What do you think about that? Now, my mother will be spinning in her grave because she was a former prosecutor, and she sent people to prison for marijuana, not jail, prison for marijuana. You know? So she had very little tolerance for this entire discussion. So, so as a kid growing up, there was never a discussion. Hey, is it okay if I smoke marijuana? And then my friends want to come over. There are all these cops that are getting her to sign warrants for other stuff. So nobody wanted to come over to my house. Right? So there's always cops. So anyway, anyway, I'm a little off the subject, but you kind of get the idea. So we talk about land and natural resources. What we're really talking about, things which come to us by virtue of our being on the same planet, but we don't have, there's no market for them necessarily. We create markets for some of these, particularly things like land. Obviously, land has become real estate. So as a result, we have corralled some of these. And by the way, anthropologists, and I don't claim to have an anthropological background, will say that as people became more interested in exchange with others, then we took these items of value and we changed their very identity. That animals cease to become animals. They were animals. There's the animal kingdom, and there's a subset of the animal kingdom we call livestock. And that was those animals that we can corral, a very small subset of the animal kingdom that we can control, right? And what are they? Pigs, goats, horses, sheep, cattle. That's about it, I guess, maybe. But we've never been able to, we can't do anything with giraffes and zebras They don't like to be, we can't eat them, we can't cut them up or anything like that. But we changed their identity. And plants, some plants that are food crops, we stopped calling them plants and we call them growing crops. And so it's the very identification of those. And so we create markets, but we create markets for the byproduct of some of these natural resources, but they come to us by virtue of our being on the same planet. Okay. All right. The second of these is labor. And when we talk about labor, what we're really talking about here, and this is going to be a little bit of a confusing sidetrack, or so it seems, but I hope not to make it too confusing. And that is what we're really talking about is something we call human capital. Human capital. All right. Now, what on earth am I talking about that? And to make matters worse, we get number 3 is capital. So what is number 2? And why are we using the term capital here? Okay, well, first of all, let's back up a little bit and just give a definition of capital, because the term capital is probably the most ill-defined, but most widely used term everywhere in economics and finance. That's certainly that I can think of. You could say that if I'm a business, the excess of my assets over my liabilities is my capital. Is that a correct statement? Yes, it's a correct statement. Or I could say if I own a house, it's the equity that I've got in my house. That's my capital in the house. Is that a true statement? Yes. That would be an example. So capital is simply going to be defined for all categories of use anywhere as anything which can be built upon to produce future value. Anything which can be built upon to produce future value. So think about in football, how many times do we hear this? A team fumbles the ball and the team gets it and it's a 3 and out, they've got to punt the ball and the announcer invariably says, they failed to capitalize. Failed to capitalize on that whole thing, right? So Indianapolis's quarterback kept fumbling the ball. He failed to capitalize, right? He is out for the season because he failed to capitalize, right? So you kind of get the idea of what that's about. So how does this, so if it's something that is built upon to produce future value, what are we talking about here? Because again, these are land, labor, capital in particular. Those are very old terms that go back to the 1700s. What does it mean in a more modern context when we say human capital? These are things that people bring with them to work. That is, we don't hire people. I mean, there are jobs that if you show up, that's about good enough, right? And my first job, I was in high school. I went to the grocery store. I made the minimum wage, which at the time was $3.35 an hour, and it was paid grudgingly. In fact, the manager said, "You're probably not worth $3.35, but I've got to pay that." Wow. So yeah, and my brother went to an ice cream shop that paid $1.75 an hour below the minimum wage because the guy who owned it was an accountant who figured out that it only applied to businesses over 50 employees, so or 20 employees, whatever it was, and that he could just manipulate the number of employees and pay them sub minimum wage. He goes, "You guys already eat a bunch of ice cream anyway," so that sort of thing, which is probably right, but that's not the point. So there are jobs that showing up is good enough, but instead, the labor market itself, what are employers looking for in general? So things like skills, right? So in other words, when we talk about examples of this, we're talking about skills. In other words, the ability to do things, right? What's another one that may be sort of related to skills? Knowledge. Yeah, skills. Well, let's just say skills, knowledge. What's the one thing that you can't teach and you can't fudge? Right? Such as,
like, I don't know, if somebody's a people person, or if I don't want to talk to anybody,
could
and I'm like an introvert, that's like
that
something
could
that I
be.
have that I can't really teach to anybody, or I can't get it.
Interpersonal skills.
Yeah.
Can I freelance on your?
Somebody's drive.
That's a good one. Yeah. Can you? And that may be you may be able to fudge that a little bit. All right. So maybe their motivation, right? Motivation that might be hard to, because everybody's motivated, right?
No, not everybody.
Or everybody applying for jobs, is motivated, right?
Well, people are motivated to
Not
have a job.
necessarily.
You're going to be the worst interviewee in the world. Really, people go to interviews and don't say they're motivated.
I think for unemployment, don't they just have to like show that they're submitting applications?
Oh, for unemployment, yeah.
Yeah.
You don't even have to call. You just have
I
to
mean,
file an application.
I know
or
there's a
even
lot of
say
like
you-
no shows for interviews.
I had a brother-in-law, right? I shouldn't. It's not
I
out
just
there.
applying to
Sorry.
apply. Yeah.
I had a relative. I told you.
I show.
a relative who's unemployed for about a year, is laid off, and he didn't even apply for these places. He just applied at the bread company on 4th Street or whatever. And I applied at the, I go, did you apply? No.
I haven't.
He goes, what are they gonna do, catch me? It's like, well, you maybe, what if they do catch you? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, so my motivation was one, somebody else said something, motivation, what's the one thing that you can't, what's the one thing that everybody wants in a would-be employee? It's part of human capital, that there's no substitute for it, that you can go to college for 20 years. Attitude starts with E. Must have experience. Yeah, must have experience. Now, that's an important one. What about experience? What about experience? This is the one you can't fudge it. You can't, I mean, you could, well, I mean, you could say I worked 10 years.
You can try and find it.
IBM, but once they start checking into your resume, it can fall apart. Because you can call any employer and say, hey, I'm just doing a background, I'm just doing a verification. Did so-and-so work here from 97 to 2007? And they'll probably tell you. I mean, they won't tell you what they earned or anything like that, but they'll probably say whether they worked there or not. If they didn't work there, they'll say, who, what? No. You know, that sort of thing. So experience. Now, what's important about experience? It's the sense that there are things you cannot teach some people, certain things, because you just have to experience it. You just can't teach it. You just cannot teach it. Now, there are a lot of occupations which are very much training and education driven, things like engineering and accounting and whatnot, where you've got to have that sort of educational background, but it doesn't substitute for experience, does it? It really doesn't. And my mom was in the legal profession for a lot of years. She eventually left and crossed over to the dark side and became a defense lawyer. And she thought, well, she had criminals. Anyway, they paid. So anyway, when she left, that, you know, some of her partners would call and say, you know what, we got a guy who's accused of this and this, and how do we argue this, and where do we file this, and what would, you know, and they just didn't know because they didn't have the background that she had, you know, in criminal law, and to know what to do in that certain case. Because you can look all you want, maybe you can't find what you're looking for, but somebody's got experience should be able to handle that much easier. In fact, I would go so far as to say experience probably trumps education in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, in a lot of jobs, I really believe that. You know, I'm not saying education is not worthwhile. It is. We probably ought to include education because I ought to do my job here, right? And justify my existence and my paycheck. I'm not saying education is not important, but I think in many ways, experience is really, really, really important. And there's no substitute for it. You simply got to have it. In fact, some employers won't hire people without experience, which leads to the whole catch-22 sort of conundrum where, how do I get experience? Nobody will hire me. And nobody will hire me because I don't have experience. It's kind of like that whole catch-22 about credit. How can I get credit if I don't have credit? Nobody will lend me money because I don't have credit, right? It's that catch-22 sort of situation. And the answer to that is you've just got to work your way into the door. That's whether it's credit or whether it's getting a job or whatever. And a lot of people, by the way, take off and do different jobs than what they started doing. They have absolutely no background whatsoever in what they're doing. I was in banking for a lot of years, and the guy that headed up our division was a labor lawyer who just happened to know our chairman, and they brought him over to do something that was totally unrelated, and it ended up running a major division of a bank. He had no banking background, and it was obvious he had no banking background. At least he was honest and said, I'm not really a banker, but I am your boss, you know, that sort of thing. But he was adequate and did what he could do because he was smart enough and had enough experience. He could work his way in and figure some things out. So experience, I think, is irreplaceable. It's that part of human capital equation that people are looking for. And when it comes to things like education, in fact, there are occasions in which, and I hate to sort of undersell the value of education, but there are cases in which sometimes people deliberately leave things off resumes in terms of educational background because why? Why would you want to do that? Would you want more qualifications on your resume?
Might not be overqualified.
You might be overqualified. You might not get the job. Right. So there was a guy that worked for my dad who took a job as a salesman. He was a very good salesman. And then one day said, hey, you know what? I really have a job. He goes, oh, shoot. What are you going to be? You're going to be a chemist for Dow Chemical. He goes, you're going to do what? He goes, it's not like you can apply. Hey, I'm a chemist. He goes, yeah, I've got a PhD in chemistry. He goes, you have what? He didn't. He goes, you're right. You're right. He wouldn't have hired, you know. And there was a recession. The guy needed a job, and he was very good at what he did. But it wasn't. But he wasn't doing what he should have been doing, right? If you have gone all the way through to do that, you probably are best suited for doing what it is you're doing. So education, but I would dare say experience is a big one. Okay, having said all this, then let's go back to capital. What capital is, because it still meets the same definition of capital. When we talk about very much board space here, do I? This term capital, this is 1, 2, 3. Capital is the oldest construction of the oldest usage of the term is what we use here, and we're talking about physical productive assets. Physical productive assets. These are assets used in production, and even though today this definition itself has got a little bit of problematical nature, because as we'll see with the physical flow, the circular flow model here, which is probably about the last thing that we'll cover tonight, that the physical nature of a lot of what we do is becoming less and less important. But still, so like software, we still go to this area of capital, and software has no physical substance, simply intellectual property. But it meets the definition of capital, doesn't it? Why do we buy software for a business? So that it can be more what software is all about, right? And even though it has no physical substance. So even the term physical here is a little bit outdated, but it would include things like property, plant, equipment. Remember that from accounting, property, plant, equipment. All those things we call fixed assets. Things that we have, we're not trying, they're not inventory, we're not selling them, we're using them to make whatever it is we're doing. Okay, so that's what capital is, the very oldest conception, but it would include non-physical assets as well. So the term physical here should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, just because of the fact that maybe the physicality is not as important. So things like intellectual property would also fit in this category. Things like formulas and trade secrets and patents and copyrights, all that would fall under the definition of capital. And then there's number 4, which is the newest of these. And again, it's the one that sort of is the X factor, entrepreneurial ability. How would we define entrepreneurial ability? What is the definition? I have no board space. What is the definition of entrepreneurial abilities or entrepreneurship?
Ability to take an idea and mold it into a business.
Okay. Take an idea and mold it into a business. Okay. That's pretty close to what I'll give you here. And it's the ability and willingness to assume risk. Okay. Do we agree that's a pretty good definition? Ability and willingness to assume risk. So, but I will agree it's business risk. Business risk. It's business risk that we're talking about here. Not just getting on a scary ride at cliffs. That's risk, right? But business risk, which is different. Right. Risk capital, right. And so it's assuming business. Now think about this. And by the way, in microeconomics, there's an entire field of study called behavioral economics that studies this idea of why people do what they do, and why it's sort of the intersection of economics and psychology. That we're wired differently, some of us. And so some of us like risk and some of us don't like risk. And how do we define risk? So first of all, what is the definition of risk? Because I think we have in our heads what risk is, but there's a very distinct definition in economics about what risk is. Risk is the variability of an outcome, of an expected outcome. The more uncertain the outcome, the riskier it is. The less uncertain the outcome, the less risky it is. So if I set my alarm clock for 7 in the morning, I expect what? Sun's going to come up. The ghost next door. I mean, I'm going to wake up, right? I'm going to be alive, right? I'm assuming that. Now, am I guaranteed that? No, I'm not guaranteed that, right? But it's a pretty good bet. It's worth betting on that I should set my alarm clock. If I think I'm not going to wake up, I got to do something different with my life, right? But you get the idea. That's not particularly risky. But if I buy Bitcoin and I put $10,000 in Bitcoin, and I think that's going to go up. I think it's going to double. Bitcoin's going to double that for sure. It's going to be worth 20,000 by Christmas. What do you got? Do I know that? I mean, how risky is that outcome? It's pretty darn risky. By the way, I wouldn't advise anybody to put anything in Bitcoin, but you do what you like. So that's a pretty. So it's an uncertain outcome. So as a result, that makes it risky. Now, here's the thing. So how does this involve behavioral economics and as it relates to entrepreneurship? So there's a continuum of behavior that behavioral economists have talked about, and that is this idea of, on the one polar extreme, risk aversion, and on the other extreme, risk seeking. And that is, most of us are somewhere in the middle, but we're heavily skewed. And that is, what, are we more risk averse or are we more risk seeking? Where's the balance? Where do we mostly skew? We're risk averse. We don't like risk because we like to know what we get ourselves into. Are there people who the riskier something is, they like it more? They want more of it. There are risk seekers, right? And what are they end up usually doing for a living? Race car drivers, firefighters, entertainers, they take big risks, right? Those kind of things. That's not for most of us, right? It's not for most of us, but there are risks. And we know this kind of behavior exists, right? By the way, what is the most dangerous occupation in America? Trick question. That's not really a trick. No, it's not a trick question. Anybody know what the most dangerous occupation is? Race car driver. Race car driver is the most dangerous occupation. So they have a high casualty rate. So either they don't die, a lot of times are injured so badly they can't drive. So it's an extremely risky occupation. But there aren't very many people who do it, so it's not like your next door neighbor's race car driver, that type of thing. So when we talk about riskiness, there are people who are willing to assume risk and take on risk. And in a business context, there's something called entrepreneurs. Now, by the way, there are people who like to take risks, and it sometimes pays off with it. Because the bigger the risk, the bigger the payoff usually. That's sort of a truism of pretty much anything that involves any kind of what we call a stochastic process, a random statistical process. So think about this. Think about when we think of entrepreneurs as individuals, what are some of the names that come to mind that kind of pop up? Because we can go back to Henry Ford, but more commonly, more recent names would be what? Elon Musk. Okay, Elon Musk. Who else? What's that?
I just thought he's risking a lot of his business. He's just amazing.
I've got something to say. Well, I'm not going to talk about E.
Oh, yeah. My apologies.
Well, think about Bill Gates as a good example. Okay, so what did Gates do? He left Harvard, arguably the best university in the world, because he said what? He goes, they can't teach me anything anymore, right? What? That's pretty audacious. They can't teach me anything anymore. So he moved to Albuquerque to start a software company in an industry that really didn't exist. Was audacious enough to go to the chairman of IBM and say, I've got an operating system for your business, because they're looking for an operating system. And he goes, I've got one. He didn't have it. He ended up buying an operating system from somebody, and then adapted and then made it his own, and then was audacious enough to say, I don't want to sell it to you, I want to license it. And IBM didn't know what they were doing, clearly, because that's where the money is in licensing, software. That way, and you can keep selling software. You don't actually own the software, you are leasing it. Essentially what's going on. But was that a risky thing to do? I mean, if somebody said to you, I'm gonna leave Harvard, it's Harvard, are you kidding me, Harvard, really? I mean, to go start what software? What's that? So that paid off for him, obviously. Another one that I really like a lot, and she's out of the news, but is Martha Stewart. I think is a good example. Martha Stewart had a very successful career on Wall Street and left it to start a catering business, right? And the catering business became a multimedia organization. And then she ended up going to prison. And so some people will say, but she went to prison. It almost confirms my point, doesn't it? She took an extreme risk and got caught doing something and ended up going to prison. But isn't that part of the whole risk-seeking behavior? Taking a huge risk and then lying to the FBI. By the way, she went to prison not for illegal stock trading, which is what she could have gone. And by the way, since she had a career on Wall Street, she couldn't argue. I didn't know what I was doing. Right? That defense was gone. So, and I didn't even know it was illegal to lie to the FBI. I just thought it was your job. Tell your side of the story, whatever that, But so she went to prison for that. But that's kind of that kind of fits into the whole picture of ups and downs and all that. Entrepreneurship, it's this willingness to assume risk. And with big risks come big rewards. And so entrepreneurability has sort of worked its way into becoming sort of its own standalone character. And I know that for a long time, a lot of economists didn't like the fact this was a fourth inclusion into the list, thinking that was really a subset of number 2. But I think that over time, I think we're starting to see that, particularly as behavioral economists do more and more work on this idea of risk-seeking behavior, that there are a subset of people out there who will start new businesses, and that's something that would terrify a lot of people. It would absolutely freak out a lot of people to start a business, to wake up every day knowing that it's just you, and you got to keep the lights on and whatnot. I think most people would much prefer to get up and go to work at a place like this. I don't have to worry about whether or not CNN is paying its light bills, right? It's not my problem. It is not my problem, right? So if I own CNN, which I don't obviously, but then it would be all on me. So that so we're not all wired. This is that interesting area of behavioral economics that I think is worth exploring. Okay. All right. So questions about any of that? Well, so what we're going to do, and I know we're sort of weaving in and out of the first 2 chapters here. And I'm doing that by on purpose, just because I think there's a sort of order that I think some of this logically flows, and that I think is easier than sort of taking things in order. And, so in other words, in the first couple of chapters, it really covers the who, what, when, where, why of economics, right? Who's who? So this is the who, and as economic actors, who's who? And so we've really got 3 main actor groups going on within economic actors. And by the way, sometimes if you were, I know a lot of people will look on other resources like websites and YouTube videos and Khan Academy, all kinds of other resources, and they may see this listed as economic agents. There is sort of a movement toward calling these actors agents, because it's sort of, particularly when it comes to firms and governments, you're acting as an agent. We're all individuals. It's all social science, but sometimes we act on behalf of another. But nonetheless, I like the term actors because actors do what? They play roles. And the same actor can play different roles depending on what we're asked to do. So Harrison Ford is both Han Solo. Wait, is he Han Solo? Okay, and he's also Indiana Jones, right? Yes. So Harrison Ford, but different roles, right? So, but you and I are actors playing different roles, right? So I work until 8:20 tonight, right? Right now I'm an employee, right? When I get off, and let's say I go to Smith's when I get off, then I'm what? What's my role? I'm an employee now. A consumer, right? Am I the same person? Right. So you get the idea. So we change roles. So sometimes we're employees, sometimes we're consumers, sometimes we're employers, right? And so you kind of get that idea. So when we talk about these actor groups, let's talk about households first. Households are comprised of what we call natural persons, and I put that in quotes because it's really sort of a legal expression. Natural persons are basically people like we do people do, biological entities, right? And I know that sounds a little bit obvious, but there are cases in which individuals act not as individuals, but as on behalf of some other legal representation, like an estate, like a trust, and that sort of thing. Not in a business form, but in some other legal entity. Okay, like an estate or trust. But we're talking about natural persons, and a household can be as small as 1 person. Households can be as small as 1 person. And I know that when we talk about households, there was sort of a movement some time ago, 60s, 70s, I guess, to sort of redefine households as individuals rather than households, because of the changing nature of what households were about. That households in the 1950s, television and sitcom would be, a man and a woman married to each other with 2.3 children, so to speak, right? So, and then as things have changed, there could be multiple generations living in a household. It could be same sex, it could be of adults, it could be multiple generations of children, it could be all kinds of different relationships. And so married, unmarried, all that is sort of irrelevant. So the idea was the mixing demographic characteristics in the mind of some people said, why don't we just not call these households? Because you can't really define what a household is. But then I think we sort of retain that mostly because households still act economically the same way, despite their changing internal dynamics, right? We tend to have fewer children today, but we tend to have more generations of members living in households. And so that is a little bit different. And that's never really gone away, but it is changing. Of course, now that gay marriage is perfectly legal in all 50 states, that has sort of changed things, but that still does not negate the economic role that households play, even though they could be as small as 1 person, but they still behave in the very same fashion. And that's really the key issue, is that people's economic behavior has not changed despite the changes going on otherwise. Okay.
If there's a house, a 4-bedroom house, it's a rental and there's 4 individual tenants in it, is that a household or is that 4 individual?
Four individual houses. Yeah. 4 individual houses. Yeah. Yeah. I would think so. Wouldn't you? If it's 4 rental units in the house. Or you're talking about 4 people living in the same house?
Yeah.
Oh,
4-bedroom.
well, that's a good. Oh, I thought you meant like a 4-plex. It's a good question. I don't know the
Yeah.
answer. I would say it's maybe probably 1 household. Wouldn't you think?
It's
If
one
they were
address.
roommates, I would call it separate households just because they're
Just
gonna look out for themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think I would. That was my first
The only
thinking, but I
thing-
also thought you
That
covered.
proves how hard it is to define.
Well, it does prove it's hard to find. Yeah, and I think you're kind of right about that too. I know when I got divorced from my first wife, I lived in a house like 3 other guys, and one of the guys just kind of went missing for a couple weeks. And we thought, at what point do we call the cops? You know, and first of all, he was in Florida, some person, so he was fine. And it was funny because one of my friends said, had it been women living together, they would have called right away, right? Because women
Yeah,
check it,
yeah.
they report. They wanted to know.
Yeah.
Guys could care less. He was like, this guy was gone. I didn't know he was gone for like a week and a half. I didn't know he's gone. I wasn't worried. I guess I wasn't worried. Figured he was okay. I mean, so to answer your question, I don't know the answer to 4 people living in a household. So that's a good question. So okay, what about business firms? And so here we have 2 distinct definitions. And I want to make clear that we are, I'm deliberately not including a fairly important part of the economy. That's the non-profit part of the economy. But I'm doing it mostly because of the fact that nonprofits, as important as they are, and we're talking about lots of organizations that have lots of economic impact. Lots of hospitals are non-for-profit, lots of colleges, universities, research institutes, religious organizations. A lot of these are nonprofit, but at the end of the day, economically, they tend to behave very similarly to for-profit entities. They really do. I've never actually worked in the nonprofit sector, but when I was a banker, I had a lot of customers who were nonprofits. And they had the same sorts of motivations. They were always worried about cost. They were always worried about payroll and paying people too much and all this other stuff, and all that. But here we're going to define firms very distinctly as being for-profit, because it makes the understanding of their economic end goals a bit more clear, and then privately owned, that is non-governmental. Now, so we know we've taken out the nonprofit sector. We've sort of lumped them in here into firms. And having said all this, though, there are still entities out there that are not easy to identify because they've got sort of a quasi-governmental nature. And that is they've got such tight connections with government that we really don't know what they are. Like Sandia National Labs, what is that? It's kind of hard to know where you categorize that. It's really hard. So we know that they're out there, there are entities like that. Los Alamos National Labs. In fact, I think Sandia is actually administered by the University of California, which is a government entity. Or was it Los Alamos National Labs? One of them is regulated by UC Davis, I think. So you get the idea. It's sometimes difficult to make these determinations. And so, but whenever we create these categories, we always risk not capturing everybody, okay? This third one, though, is, I think, relatively straightforward. Governments, which include the federal and state division. This is a feature of our Constitution, is the fact that we have 2 separate forms of government, federal government and state government. And all local government, that is county, local, and whatnot, is a function of state government. It's a subset of state government everywhere in the United States. And whatever that division is, whether it's a school district, I know where I grew up, we had townships, which we don't have here. All those are functions of state government. Okay, so federal and state. We're gonna get into this. So next week we're gonna start to talk about all of the government spending and what government spends money on. And it might surprise you a little bit. I'll try to show you what some of the numbers are as to what we're producing, what we're spending money on throughout the economy. Okay. All right. So if we put these together, we can arrive at a couple of intangible and maybe arbitrary divisions, that is sectors. And economists like to create sectors, and that is, they're simply divisions where we group people together based upon commonality of behavior, commonality of interests, or some other type of thing. And sometimes they're irrelevant. So for instance, is it relevant? Is it necessary that the Philadelphia Eagles are in the NFC and the Pittsburgh Steelers are in the AFC? Is it got to be that way? Or is that most likely arbitrary? It's arbitrary, right? Does it make any difference, right? Right, so it's arbitrary. Now, but is it, so what about when it's not arbitrary, when it makes sense? And that's what we're trying to do, is to try to find non-arbitrary divisions. And that is we put households and business firms together as the private sector. These are terms that are probably familiar to a lot of you. And then as households and firms make decisions privately and in their actors' self-interest. So this is really a distinguishing factor between a pure capitalist economy, or mostly free market economy, and a command economy, is that you do have self-interest and the ability to express self-interest and the ability to own private property and to pursue self-interest. Maybe greed is a little bit out of bounds at times, particularly if it is illegal conduct, but nonetheless, self-interest is not frowned upon. And the public sector is governed in all its agencies where decisions are made publicly, or really should be, and in the public interest. Okay, so those are the two sectors. And so this gives rise to a, gosh, I wish I had more board space here, but in fact, I think I'm going to have to, I forgot about the video that I've been writing on the board here, and I've forgotten to swivel the camera. So let me do that here, because what I'm going to do is, and it's in your textbook in I think chapter 1, but as I said earlier, I think we're sort of swiveling between chapters 1 and, oops, wrong way. Between chapters 1 and 2. What I'm going to do is create what's called the circular flow model. And the circular flow model, if you were to Google this, you would find literally millions of hits on other websites, on course handouts from econ courses all over it. And so the circular flow model basically is a graphic model of the economy. So it's the first model that we're going to be building in this class. Okay, and we talk about the term model. What is the term model? How do we define it? And we say that a model is simply a representation. It's a graphic, it's symbolization, it's minimization, it is sometimes simulation. But we all know models. We're all familiar with models because we've seen them all the time, right? A Barbie doll is a model, right? A G.I. Joe doll is a model. And so we don't need for those to have internal organs and toenails and all that to know what's going on. Likewise, a blueprint for a house doesn't have to have light switches and carpeting and all that. We know what's going on. And so what we're going to do, and this is also the explanation for why we have what are seemingly missing pieces when it comes to the actor groups. And so if we're to group these together, and I've got no particular order here as to where these should lie, we'll just put households out here. We'll put government in the middle, which is not to say that the central government is all seeing and all doing, but it's a good place to sort of put these. And by the way, this circular flow model, we're going to add bits and pieces to this over time. And so this is so what do we got going on here? These are, by the way, pretty fundamental relationships in economics. And so we're trying to track the exchange of value. Remember, we were interested in the exchange of value. And what is the value of something? It's what someone's willing to pay for it. So one of the most basic exchanges of value is that which moves from firms to households. And we simply call them goods. And I don't think we're going to get to this tonight, but we'll talk about the difference between goods and services, and whether or not that distinction is important or whether it's arbitrary. So the transfer of goods to households is important. But we know that the compensation for that, which must go in the other direction, right? Which is why it's an exchange, must go in this direction. And that is what we call spending. And that is a dollar flow. Okay? We'll put that as green for dollars. Likewise, what do households have to offer? And by the way, I know that and we'll talk a bit later toward the end of the class about economic theory, and there's a theory called supply side economics, which was very much in vogue among some economists years ago. And it was really, a lot of people I think misconstrued to think it was all about the supply of goods by firms, and therefore we should do what's good for business. But it also included the fact that labor is also supplied by households. Households are suppliers as well. That is, they supply labor. So as a result, labor is moved, and we know that labor is not provided for free, it's exchanged. And so as a result, wages are paid in the other direction. And wages are obviously paid in dollars or yen or pesos or euros or whatever the local currency is. So what do we got going on here? We've got this system in place. And obviously this is very rudimentary and there are lots of bits and pieces we can add. This is why there are millions of hits that you would get on a Google search for circular flow models, just because there are all kinds of different entities. We're going to open this up to the rest of the world here a bit later when we add bits to this. We'll bring in the financial sector, we'll bring in taxes and all these other kinds of things. But for right now, what we've got going on is this. You've got a fairly basic set of flows. The first of these flows that we should talk about is really like the term capital, the number 3 on the list here. It's kind of outdated a little bit. We simply call it the physical flow. And that's the exchange of goods and labor, the physical flow. At one time, that term was probably a little bit more germane to what we're talking about here, when labor was much more physical and where the goods that we bought were much more physical, things like bread and whatnot. Today, a lot of the goods we buy don't have a physical character at all, right? We go to the dentist and we don't have to load anything in the back of our car when we're done, right? I mean, what you know, probably could do, right? So, you know, but you get the idea. We go to the dentist and we get a service done. So there's nothing really physical about it. Whatever physical evidence there is incidental, right? If I go to an accountant to get my taxes done, I walk out with pieces of paper, but I didn't pay for pieces of paper. I paid for services to get taxes done. So the term physical is a little bit outdated. So one term that's sort of come about, and I started hearing a lot more when the financial crisis began, was the quote unquote real economy. The real economy, as opposed to the money economy, which is a little bit different. And in fact, it is. So when we talk about this green set of arrows here, we're talking about something called the financial flow. Financial flow, or the quote unquote money economy. And the financial crisis itself, one of the reasons why it was difficult was the fact that this operates on much more on the down low than does the market for goods and services, the quote unquote real economy. And in fact, it is the way we behave as human beings is a little bit different the way we approach either set of arrows here. The red arrow, which is the physical flow, and the green arrow, which is the money flow, right? We want everybody to know that we're a heart surgeon, or we're an astronaut, or we used to be the pitcher for the Braves, or whatever, right? We really want them to know that, but we really don't want them to know what we spent for our RV in our lot. We want them to know we have an RV. We don't want people to know what we spent. In fact, what's one of the most grotesque and rudest things you can ask somebody? You meet somebody for the first time. A lot of times, one question is, "What do you do?" Right?
How much do you make?
How much do you make? Okay, so it's perfectly fine to ask what you do, right? Perfectly fine. But what is the most rudest thing? How much do you earn? That just out of bounds. Even though I've got a little niece who always does that. We ask people what they weigh, what they earn. It's like you really, you gotta stop. You gotta stop. You gotta get some social skills going pretty soon, at some point. So because we don't want really, so the green arrow is operating sort of on the down low. And we really don't know what's going on a lot of times. In fact, a lot of times we keep this sort of confidential because we really don't want people to know, for whatever reason, what our financial circumstances are. And by the way, if we go back to the intersection of economics and psychology, there was a psychiatrist named Scott Peck, who I think is now deceased, but he talked about the fact that this is really dangerous to our own health, that we're not all more forthcoming about our own financial lives. Because it means that if we're having trouble, we should be able to talk to others about it. Maybe they can help us not to do the same things they've done. And we should be able to tell people exactly what we earn, what we got on deposit in the bank, all that. That's his point of view. He's a psychiatrist. I don't know. What do you think? Is that good advice, or is that just wacko advice from somebody who himself is a psychiatrist? Well, you can think about it on your own. My point is that one is very overt and explicit, and that's the real economy, hence the term, and the other is a little bit more difficult to deal with, which is one reason why dealing with economic problems which have to do with the money economy is oftentimes difficult. Keep in mind, even and having worked in banking for a lot of years, I can tell you that bankers and people everywhere in the financial world are very secretive people. It is, and by law, we're really supposed to be secretive. But a lot of us as economists did not even know that there were these things called credit default swaps, which is a term I'd never heard before, but became part of the sort of the weaponized financial dynamite that blew up the whole banking system. I'd never even heard of them before, what they were. And it's because of the fact that this operates more or less in the down low. And so it is, and that is a difficult thing. So whatever, and so here's the trick. If we sort of step back and say, what are we doing here? Why are we studying economics in the first place? It's almost like the question, why do we study dentistry, right? We study dentistry so we can solve dental problems. Well, we study economics so we can solve economic problems. But the most difficult economic problems are these that affect the financial sector, right? And because they're oftentimes difficult to know what's going on, and we've really got to sort of pry into these people's affairs in order to sort of pick this apart and construct it. By the way, we'll introduce the financial sector like that, okay? So we got the financial flow and the physical flow, and we're missing one thing here, and that is this. Up until this point, we had this idea that we've got one thing going for another thing, but what about a non-quid pro quo, right? We've got a quid pro quo. I buy a loaf of bread, I get the loaf of bread, I pay the $2 for the loaf of bread, right? Quid pro quo, right? And the bread is worth how much? $2, right? Because that's what I paid for, right? I go to work and I get paid, right? I go to work when my salary is apparently what I'm worth. Okay, but are there transactions in which there is no quid pro quo? And there are. And those are taxes, right? Those are our taxes. We pay taxes and we get nothing specific in return for that. And this is where a lot of people go wrong in their understanding of what taxes are all about. It happens all the time where people have tax protests and say, I'm not going to pay my taxes because I don't like X, Y, Z that the government's doing, so therefore I'm going to reduce the amount of taxes I pay, right? And believe it or not, the IRS is actually kind of patient with these people, even though they have absolutely no legal basis upon which to stand. There was a tax protest, I remember a few years ago in Chicago, where a couple of guys decided they were against the Iraq War. And they figured out how much of the percentage of the federal budget was dedicated to the Iraq War, and they just lowered their tax bill by that percentage. And so we don't support the war, we're not going to pay it. The IRS said, well, okay, thank you for your concern. Guess what? You owe it, so pay it. And we'll put you on a payment plan. We'll work with you. We'll help you. They stood firm, and to the point where they ended up standing so firm they both went to prison over a very modest amount. But you know, the more you cause this ruckus, it doesn't work that way. And why did and I know people, I had friends of mine who were still in banking saying, why did the IRS dig in their heels? Just to make an example, these two stools that were, I think they owed like 10,000 between them. It was not that much money. You know, and it's not worth going to prison for it, but they were standing on principle. But that's fine. That's because of the fact that we cannot allow people to have this idea that we pick and choose where our tax dollars go. Where would that end, right?
And the response, yeah.
Where would it end? You could say, I don't have children in public schools, so 60% of our property tax goes to public schools. I'm just going to lower my tax bill by 60%. It doesn't affect me. I don't have children in public school. That's what you could say, right? Well, we can't allow that. We can't allow that to happen, right? And so as a result, taxes, there is no red arrow going back the other direction. There really isn't. In fact, yes, we could construct a red arrow here because government does buy stuff from firms like desks and vehicles and furniture and all that. So I guess it goes the other direction, does it? Where goods go. But it's not a quid pro quo. The value of those is something different. In fact, there is a red arrow or a green arrow, and that's government spending. Government spending, but it's not dedicated to taxes. And so it doesn't work that way. Taxes are a one-way street. It's the only non-reciprocal mandatory transaction that I can think of in the economy.
It's because you can't really quantify. I mean, we do get
benefits.
things
Right.
for our taxes.
Right.
Places like this.
Right.
But
We do.
It's hard to quantify.
It's hard to quantify. And let's give it even more meta and say, okay, if you were to say, okay, what's the value of the Environmental Protection Agency to you and your family? Give me a dollar figure. Come on, give me a dollar figure. What's the value of the Environmental Protection Agency? Could you do it? I'm not sure I could do it. You know, I'm not sure that I could really do it. I mean, first of all, on what basis would I determine the value? Right? I don't know. I don't even know how to begin to do it. Now, do we agree that it probably ought to be something like the Environmental Protection Agency? Yeah. You know, I mean, you can disagree whether that should exist or not exist, but I think we get the idea that it does exist. But what's the value of that? I have no idea. You know, likewise, what is the value of the FBI, right? You probably don't want to see the FBI at your house, right? But you don't care if they go to somebody else's house, right? Those guys across the street. That's right, right? We don't really want them to see your house, but you are paying for them, but what is the dollar value? There is no quid pro quo, so it's the only transaction that is compulsory. The rest are voluntary, including the labor transaction. I don't have to come to work, right? I really don't. I could not, I could just not show up to that, right? Now, maybe I could do that one time, you know, and then I'll.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
Thanksgiving.
right, Thanksgiving, right? Next time you'll see me, I'll be at Subway, right? So, you know, or Burger King or something. So, but you get the idea. We don't have to go to work. Right? We don't have to do a lot of these things. We don't have to buy goods. I mean, there are people who live off the grid. These shows like people who live in Alaska, they're totally off the grid. The shows are kind of cool. That's why.
They get paid for the shows.
And that's why they have a TV show. It's because it's so weird, right? People living off the grid. But you get the idea that there aren't very many actors who live like that. But we all pay taxes. So there is no red arrow that goes in the direction. So and we're going to talk much more about the role of government as we get into this next week. And we'll start to sort of peel apart what these roles are that these actors play and how we can measure them and how important they are. And I think a lot of people will be surprised to know how important the household sector is to the economy. The fact that over 2/3 of total dollars spent somewhere in the economy is by households. And it's usually not so much on needs so much as it is wants for the most part. Realizing, of course, that there is disagreement over what's a need and what's a want. But nonetheless, I think there are some things that are very clearly wants, like leisure travel and satellite TV, all that is definitely a want. Okay. All right. So are there questions for me about anything we've talked about tonight? Well, we've got one night in the books, right? So week one is done. If you have any questions, feel free to get with me. By the way, I didn't give you my cell phone number. Let me do that. It is 977-44632. Just feel free to get with me if you have. It's 505. So if you have any questions, feel free to get with me. It's probably easier to text me than it is to call me. And but you can. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, as long as it's not 3 in the morning or something. I'm usually up fairly late, but it's better because if you call me, you might wake my kid up. Okay. All right. Great to meet everybody. I will see you all next time.
Okay.
Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
That's a quick way of-
Custom.